Welcome, restless souls of the endless night, to the forgotten corners of Jujutsu society, where untold stories whisper in the shadows of legend. Tonight, we honor those whose names were never carved into history, whose sacrifices went unrecorded, whose brief flames illuminated truths that the famous never glimpsed. These are the overlooked hearts that beat with equal courage, the forgotten voices that spoke wisdom into darkness, the souls whose quiet heroism shaped a world that barely remembered their existence. So settle into the gentle embrace of understanding, let your breathing match the rhythm of remembrance, and allow yourself to drift among the spirits of those who deserved better than obscurity. Close your eyes when you feel ready, and let the infinite compassion of the forgotten welcome you into sleep as we begin our journey through the beautiful, tragic stories of Jujutsu Kaisen's most undervalued souls. The rain fell with unusual persistence on the day Junpei Yoshino first contemplated the weight of human cruelty, each droplet against his apartment window reflecting the tears that had become as constant as breathing in his 15 years of quiet suffering. He was a boy who had learned too early that the world contained reservoirs of malice so deep that even childhood innocence could not navigate around them, that some people derived satisfaction from watching others break under pressure, applied with surgical precision and casual indifference. His mother slept in the next room, exhausted from another double shift at the convenience store, where she endured the small humiliations that minimum wage employment demanded from single parents, trying to maintain dignity while poverty slowly eroded every foundation they had managed to build. Junpei loved her with the fierce protectiveness that comes from recognizing that someone precious is also fragile, understanding that she was the only person in his world who saw him as worthy of care rather than target practice for adolescent sadism. The bullying that defined his school experience was not the dramatic violence that might have prompted adult intervention, but the sustained psychological warfare that teenagers perfected when they recognized someone who would not fight back, would not report them, would simply absorb whatever pain they chose to inflict, while maintaining the silence that made their cruelty sustainable. They had identified him as safe victim early in middle school, someone whose isolation guaranteed that his suffering would remain private entertainment rather than public scandal. The bruises they left were carefully placed where teachers would not see them, the insults delivered in whispers that could be denied if overheard, the social exclusion orchestrated with the kind of systematic precision that suggested they understood exactly how much damage they were causing, while maintaining plausible deniability about their intentions. Junpei's responses to this treatment had evolved from attempts at resistance to strategies for survival that prioritized minimizing additional harm over asserting his right to basic human dignity. His refuge was found in the darkness of movie theaters, where he could disappear into stories that offered him what reality refused to provide. Heroes who protected the innocent, villains who faced consequences for their actions. Worlds where justice existed as more than theoretical concept that adults discussed while ignoring its absence in the lives of children who needed it most urgently. The films he loved were often dismissed as escapist fantasy, but for someone whose daily existence felt like sustained assault on his sense of worth, escape was not luxury but necessity. The philosophy that began to crystallize in his mind during those long afternoons of solitary movie watching was built around the recognition that expecting good treatment from other people was naive assumption that led inevitably to disappointment and pain. If he could eliminate expectation, he reasoned, he might also eliminate the capacity to be hurt by the inevitable cruelty that seemed to define human interaction at its most basic level. The quote that resonated most deeply with his developing worldview was the observation that the opposite of love was not hatred but indifference, words that seemed to offer him a path toward emotional safety that did not require him to become like his tormentors. If he could achieve genuine indifference toward the people who hurt him, perhaps their actions would lose the power to cause him suffering that felt disproportionate to whatever satisfaction they derived from his misery. But the distinction between indifference and hatred proved more difficult to maintain than he had anticipated, particularly when the bullying escalated beyond psychological pressure into physical intimidation that made even his basic safety feel uncertain. The boys who had discovered that he would not resist their earlier cruelties began to test the boundaries of what they could do to him without facing consequences. Their experiments in cruelty growing bolder as his silence confirmed that he posed no threat to their continued enjoyment of his suffering. The morning when he found his school shoes filled with water and insects was the same morning when news broke about a mysterious incident at a local cinema where 3 students had been found dead under circumstances that defied rational explanation. The victims were older boys from a different school, but the descriptions of their personalities and behavior patterns matched his own tormentors so precisely that he felt an uncomfortable mixture of satisfaction and horror at the idea that such people could face consequences for their actions. The investigation that followed revealed details that should have been impossible, but were documented with the clinical precision that official reports demanded. Bodies discovered in sealed spaces with no evidence of how they had deed, expressions of terror frozen on faces that suggested they had seen something beyond normal human experience, crime scenes that challenged every assumption about what was physically possible within the constraints of natural law. The media coverage that followed focused on the mystery rather than the victims' characters, but Junpei's careful research revealed enough about their histories to confirm that they had been exactly the kind of people who made life unbearable for anyone they identified as vulnerable to their particular forms of entertainment. The satisfaction he felt at this discovery was complicated by his understanding that feeling pleased about anyone's death was probably evidence of moral corruption that his mother would have found deeply troubling. The creature he encountered outside the cinema where the deaths had occurred appeared first as shadow that moved independently of any light source, then as presence that made the air feel heavy with possibilities that human consciousness was not equipped to process safely. When it finally manifested in forms that his eyes could interpret, the being that called itself Mahito bore superficial resemblance to human appearance, while radiating otherness that made every instinct scream warnings about engaging with forces beyond his comprehension or control. But Junpei had spent years learning to ignore his instincts for self-preservation, and the creature's casual acknowledgement that it had indeed been responsible for the deaths of the 3 bullies created immediate bond based on shared appreciation for justice that human institutions had failed to provide. The conversation that developed between them was conducted with the kind of intellectual sophistication that Junpei had never encountered from his peers. Philosophical discussion that treated his thoughts and observations as worthy of serious consideration rather than targets for mockery. Mahito's explanation of how he had eliminated the bullies was delivered with the same tone that might be used to describe any technical achievement. Casual pride in successful application of abilities that transcended normal limitations, while acknowledging that such power came with responsibilities that conventional morality was inadequate to address. The technique he called idol transfiguration allowed him to manipulate the fundamental structure of souls themselves, reshaping human consciousness in ways that could eliminate suffering by eliminating the capacity to experience it. The philosophical framework that Mahito presented during their initial conversation was built around the recognition that human existence was inherently meaningless, that moral constraints were artificial limitations imposed by weak individuals who lacked the courage to embrace the freedom that came with accepting life's fundamental absurdity. From this perspective, Actions were justified not by their conformity to external standards, but by their authenticity to the actor's genuine desires and preferences. Hedonistic approach to existence that prioritized personal satisfaction over abstract principles. The seductive power of this worldview for someone like Junpei was immediately apparent. Here was a philosophical system that not only justified his resentment toward his tormentors, but elevated that resentment into principled stance against the hypocrisy of society that demanded victims remain passive while their oppressors faced no meaningful consequences. Mahito's casual dismissal of conventional morality as weakness disguised as virtue offered intellectual cover for impulses that Junpei had been taught to suppress, despite their apparent reasonableness given his circumstances. But the most compelling aspect of Mahito's philosophy was not its intellectual sophistication, but its practical implications for someone who had spent years feeling helpless in the face of sustained cruelty. The power that Mahito offered was not abstract concept, but immediate solution to problems that had seemed unsolvable through conventional means. Ability to ensure that people who chose to inflict suffering would experience consequences proportional to the damage they had caused. The hideout where Mahito brought him was located in spaces that existed between normal reality and something else. Architectural impossibilities that suggested the being he was dealing with operated according to rules that transcended human understanding of what was physically possible. The other creatures that inhabited this space bore varying degrees of resemblance to human forms while clearly being something fundamentally different. Entities whose conversations revealed perspectives on existence that challenged every assumption about the nature of consciousness and identity. The test that Mahito administered during Junpei's first visit to this otherworldly space was designed to evaluate not his courage or intelligence, but his capacity for moral flexibility when confronted with situations that conventional ethics could not adequately address. The scenarios he presented were variations on familiar philosophical dilemmas, but with personal stakes that made abstract reasoning feel inadequate for reaching conclusions that could guide actual decision-making in complex moral terrain. Junpei's responses revealed someone whose ethical framework had been shaped more by personal experience with injustice than by theoretical study of moral philosophy. Practical wisdom that emphasized results over methodology, while maintaining core commitments to protecting innocent people from unnecessary suffering. His willingness to consider extreme solutions to extreme problems impressed Mahito, while confirming that he possessed the psychological flexibility necessary for the kind of relationship that the curse had in mind. The friendship that developed between them over the following weeks was unlike anything Junpei had experienced with human peers. Intellectual partnership that treated his thoughts and opinions as valuable contributions rather than curiosities to be tolerated or targets for attack. Mahito's questions about human behavior and motivation revealed genuine interest in understanding perspectives that differed from his own, while offering insights about the nature of consciousness that challenged Junpei's assumptions about what it meant to be human. But beneath the philosophical sophistication of their conversations, Mahito was conducting careful psychological analysis designed to identify the specific vulnerabilities that would make Junpei useful for purposes that extended beyond mere friendship. The curse's interest in human nature was not academic curiosity, but practical research into how emotional manipulation could be refined into precise instrument for achieving strategic objectives that required human cooperation or complicity. The casual cruelty that Mahito displayed toward other humans during their time together was presented as natural expression of superior beings' relationship to inferior life forms, perspective that framed violence not as moral failing, but as honest acknowledgement of power dynamics that conventional society preferred to ignore. His experiments with human subjects were conducted with scientific detachment that suggested he viewed such activities as research rather than recreation, though his obvious enjoyment of the suffering he caused indicated that the distinction was perhaps less meaningful than he claimed. Junpei's gradual acceptance of these displays of casual violence represented his psychological adaptation to proximity with power that operated beyond human moral constraints, a process that involved systematic suppression of empathetic responses that might have interfered with his ability to benefit from association with someone who could provide solutions to his problems through methods that conventional, authority figures would never consider employing. The transformation in his thinking during this period was subtle but profound. Shift from viewing his tormentors as people who had made wrong choices towards seeing them as obstacles to his welfare that might need to be removed if other approaches proved inadequate. The philosophical framework that Mahito provided offered intellectual justification for impulses that his previous moral education had taught him to resist. Elevation of self-interest from vice to virtue, when properly understood and courageously implemented. The encounter with Yuji Itadori that interrupted his psychological journey toward embracing Mahito's worldview occurred during one of his increasingly rare visits to school, where he had gone to retrieve books from his locker, while hoping to avoid contact with classmates who had learned to view his presence as opportunity for entertainment. The pink-haired boy who intervened when his teacher made insensitive comments about his relationship with his deceased bullies radiated the kind of natural confidence that Junpei had never possessed. Easy assumption that other people were basically good and that problems could be solved through direct communication and mutual understanding. Yuji's immediate acceptance of him as potential friend was so unprecedented in Junpei's social experience that he initially suspected some form of elaborate prank designed to create new opportunities for humiliation once his guard was lowered. But the sincerity that characterized every aspect of Yuji's personality proved impossible to fake convincingly. Genuine warmth that persisted through interactions that revealed Junpei's social awkwardness and defensive suspicion of friendly overtures. The movie that they watched together during their first attempt at normal teenage friendship was chosen specifically because Junpei assumed that its extreme content would discourage further contact from someone who seemed too wholesome to appreciate art that explored humanity's capacity for violence and moral compromise. But Yuji's enthusiastic engagement with the film's themes demonstrated intellectual flexibility that exceeded his initially cheerful appearance, willingness to consider difficult questions about justice and revenge that suggested depth of character that Junpei had not expected to find in someone who seemed so naturally optimistic. The philosophical discussions that emerged from their shared appreciation for complex moral narratives revealed fundamental differences in their approaches to human nature and the possibility of positive change in individuals and society. Where Junpei's experiences had taught him to expect the worst from people while hoping to be proven wrong, Yuji's worldview was built around expectation that people were fundamentally good while acknowledging that circumstances could corrupt even well-intentioned individuals if they lacked adequate support and guidance. The question that Junpei posed about whether Yuji had ever killed anyone was intended as test of the sincerity of his expressed values. Assumption that someone involved in Jujutsu sorcery would have been forced to compromise their ideals in ways that would reveal the hypocrisy that Junpei had learned to expect from people who claimed to care about others' welfare. But Yuji's honest acknowledgement that he had never taken human life while remaining committed to avoiding such action whenever possible represented moral consistency that challenged Junpei's cynical assumptions. The explanation that Yuji provided for his refusal to consider killing as acceptable solution, even when dealing with genuinely evil people, was based on understanding that the act of taking life would fundamentally alter his relationship to existence in ways that would make it impossible to maintain the values that gave his protective impulses meaning. Once he began to view other people's lives as expendable when they conflicted with his goals, the logical endpoint would be complete erosion of the empathy that motivated his desire to protect innocent people in the first place. This perspective represented complete inversion of the philosophy that Mahito had been teaching, approach to power and responsibility that prioritized preservation of his own humanity over tactical efficiency or personal satisfaction. The strength that Yuji demonstrated was not ability to eliminate obstacles through violence, but capacity to maintain moral clarity while operating in an environment where such clarity was constantly challenged by circumstances that seemed to demand compromise of fundamental principles. The internal conflict that this conversation created for Junpei was intensified by his growing affection for Yuji as friend and his simultaneous commitment to worldview that he had developed through his relationship with Mahito. The two philosophical frameworks were incompatible in ways that forced him to choose between competing visions of what it meant to live authentically in a world that contained both genuine evil and genuine goodness in proportions that seemed impossible to calculate accurately. The friendship that continued to develop between them over the following days provided Junpei with his first experience of human relationship based on mutual respect and genuine care, rather than power dynamics that involved one person benefiting at another's expense. Yuji's consistent demonstration of interest in his thoughts and feelings, without apparent ulterior motive, was so foreign to his previous social experiences that he found himself constantly waiting for the revelation of hidden agenda that would explain such unprecedented kindness. But the waiting gradually gave way to cautious acceptance that some people might indeed be capable of caring about others without expecting anything in return, possibility that challenged the defensive pessimism that had protected him from disappointment, while also preventing him from recognizing opportunities for genuine connection when they presented themselves. The joy that began to emerge from this relationship was complicated by his awareness that accepting Yuji's friendship might require abandoning the philosophical framework that had provided him with sense of power and purpose during his darkest periods. The manipulation that Mahito orchestrated to resolve this conflict was designed with precise understanding of Junpei's psychological vulnerabilities and the specific circumstances that would cause maximum emotional damage, while providing plausible justification for abandoning his growing faith in human goodness. The placement of Sukuna's finger in his apartment was calculated to attract cursed spirits powerful enough to kill his mother, while creating situation that could be interpreted as a result of human malice rather than supernatural. Accident. The discovery of his mother's body represented destruction of the only unambiguously positive relationship in his life, loss that eliminated his primary source of emotional stability, while confirming his worst fears about the universe's fundamental hostility toward anyone who dared to hope for happiness. The grief that overwhelmed him was amplified by rage at the perceived injustice of her death and the apparent randomness of suffering that seemed to target the innocent while leaving the cruel unscathed. Mahito's explanation that the attack had been motivated by someone's resentment toward Junpei or his mother provided focus for his anguish, while reinforcing the worldview that had been challenged by his friendship with Yuji. The suggestion that human malice had been responsible for his greatest loss validated his earlier pessimism about human nature, while offering him target for the vengeance that felt like the only possible response to such devastating violation of his world. The transformation that occurred in Junpei following his mother's death was not sudden corruption, but acceleration of psychological processes that had been developing throughout his relationship with Mahito. Removal of the final constraints that had prevented him from fully embracing philosophy that justified using power to punish those who cause suffering. The grief and rage that now motivated his actions provided emotional fuel for decisions that he might have hesitated to make when his moral framework included consideration for his mother's values and expectations. The assault on his school that followed represented his complete abandonment of the person he had been trying to become through his friendship with Yuji. Return to identity built around resentment and desire for revenge against people who had made his life unbearable while facing no consequences for their cruelty. The systematic nature of his attack on classmates who had participated in his bullying demonstrated planning and calculation that revealed how thoroughly he had processed his rage into actionable strategy for achieving justice that institutional authority had failed to provide. The confrontation with his teacher, who had witnessed his abuse while doing nothing to stop it, was conducted with cold precision that reflected his complete abandonment of hope that adults could be trusted to protect children from harm when such protection might require them to acknowledge uncomfortable truths about the social dynamics they preferred to ignore. The interrogation techniques he employed demonstrated understanding of psychological pressure that had been gained through years of being subjected to such pressure without recourse or relief. Yuji's intervention in his assault represented collision between the person he had been becoming and the person he had chosen to be after his mother's death, confrontation with values that he had temporarily accepted, but now viewed as naive luxury, that he could no longer afford given what life had taught him about the true nature of human relationships and social institutions. The fight that developed between them was simultaneously physical combat and philosophical debate about the possibility of justice in a world that seemed designed to protect the cruel while abandoning the innocent. The arguments that Junpei presented during their battle were logical extensions of experiences that had shaped his understanding of how power operated in human society. Evidence-based conclusions about the futility of expecting protection from systems that seemed designed to maintain social order rather than ensure individual welfare. His rejection of Yuji's appeals was based not on inability to understand alternative perspectives, but on hard-won wisdom about the costs of maintaining faith in human goodness when such faith had repeatedly proven inadequate for preventing or addressing genuine harm. The empathy that Yuji demonstrated during their confrontation represented everything that Junpei had learned not to expect from other people, genuine concern for his welfare that persisted despite the violence he had committed and the threat he continued to pose. The offer to bring him to Jujutsu High, where he might find community among people who understood the challenges of possessing dangerous abilities, was exactly the kind of support that might have prevented his current situation if it had been available earlier in his psychological development. But the revelation of Mahito's true nature during their final conversation eliminated any possibility that Junpei might accept Yuji's offer of redemption. Demonstration that the being he had trusted as friend and philosophical mentor viewed him as disposable tool whose usefulness had been exhausted. The casual cruelty with which Mahito acknowledged his manipulation represented betrayal that completed Junpei's psychological destruction while confirming that his original pessimism about relationships based on trust had been accurate assessment of social reality. The idle transfiguration that transformed him into weapon against Yuji represented ultimate violation of his agency and identity, reduction from complex human being with thoughts and feelings to instrument of someone else's will. The brief consciousness that remained to him during this process was filled with questions that had no answers, confusion about why his attempts to find meaning and connection had led inevitably to betrayal and destruction of everything he had valued. The death that followed was both mercy and tragedy, end of suffering that had become unbearable while representing waste of potential that might have been realized under different circumstances. His final words to Yuji carried weight of accumulated grief and bewilderment, plea for understanding about why existence had proven so consistently hostile to his attempts to find safety and connection among people who shared his fundamental humanity. The impact of Junpei's death on Yuji represented completion of his education about the true nature of evil that existed in their world. Understanding that some entities were so fundamentally opposed to human welfare that attempting to reason with them or show them mercy was not compassion, but dangerous naivety that enabled continued harm to innocent people. The rage that replaced Yuji's previous reluctance to consider violence as solution reflected his recognition that protecting others sometimes required abandoning idealistic principles that assumed all conflicts could be resolved through communication and mutual understanding. The transformation in Yuji's worldview that resulted from witnessing Junpei's corruption and death would inform every subsequent decision about how to balance his commitment to preserving human life with his responsibility to prevent suffering that could only be stopped through elimination of threats that could not be reformed or contained. The lesson was painful, but necessary. Understanding that moral clarity sometimes demanded choices that felt like corruption of values that had previously seemed absolute and inviolable. Junpei Yoshino's story remained in Yuji's memory as a reminder of how quickly circumstances could transform potential allies into enemies, how essential it was to provide support and guidance to people struggling with isolation and resentment, before such struggles made them vulnerable to manipulation by forces that viewed human suffering as entertainment or tactical resource. The boy who might have been saved became symbol of responsibility that extended beyond immediate tactical concerns toward long-term cultivation of communities where people could find connection and purpose without being exploited by those who promised easy answers to complex problems. The tragedy of his brief existence was not that he had been weak or evil, but that he had been abandoned by systems designed to protect young people from exactly the kind of psychological damage that made him vulnerable to Mahito's influence. His death served as indictment of social structures that prioritized maintaining order over addressing injustice, while highlighting the urgent need for approaches to education and community support that recognize the warning signs of isolation and resentment before they developed into dangerous extremis. The forgotten boy, who had wanted nothing more than safety and connection, became testament to the importance of creating a world where such basic human needs could be met without requiring individuals to compromise their fundamental humanity in pursuit of belonging and purpose. His story whispered through the shadows of Jujutsu society as warning about the costs of failing to protect the vulnerable while serving as inspiration for those who understood that prevention was more important than punishment when dealing with the social conditions that created monsters, from children who had simply needed someone to care about their welfare more than their utility. The winter night, when Kokichi Muta first understood the true weight of his curse, was marked not by dramatic revelation, but by the quiet recognition that other children his age were learning to walk while he remained imprisoned within flesh that had betrayed him before his first breath. The heavenly restriction that had shaped his existence from conception was not the kind of supernatural limitation that granted obvious power in exchange for manageable weakness, but a cosmic joke that had given him cursed energy that could span continents while trapping his consciousness in a body that could not survive exposure to sunlight or maintain basic biological functions without mechanical assistance. His childhood had been spent in sterile rooms designed to preserve life that felt more like prolonged dying surrounded by medical equipment that kept his organs functioning while his mind developed in isolation so complete that human contact became theoretical concept rather than lived experience. The parents who loved him could touch him only through protective barriers that made affection feel like visiting someone who had already died. Their voices filtered through speakers that transformed even expressions of care into mechanical transmissions from world he could observe but never join. The cursed technique that manifested during his early years was both blessing and additional torment. Ability to control mechanical constructs from vast distances, while his physical body remained confined to spaces designed around his medical needs rather than human comfort. The puppet body that became his primary means of interacting with the world was a masterpiece of engineering that could simulate human appearance and capability while remaining fundamentally artificial, sophisticated tool that allowed him to experience approximation of normal life without ever quite achieving the genuine connection that made such experiences meaningful. The loneliness that defined his existence was not simply social isolation, but existential separation from basic human experiences that others took for granted. The feeling of wind against skin, the warmth of another person's touch, the simple pleasure of walking outside without fear that environmental factors might prove fatal to his compromised immune system. His mechanical body provided sensory data that his brilliant mind could process and analyze, but the translation between artificial input and human experience was an imperfect bridge that left him aware of what he was missing while providing no path toward obtaining it. The education that he pursued through remote learning systems was both escape and reminder of his limitations. Intellectual development that proceeded at accelerated pace, while his emotional growth remained constrained by lack of genuine social interaction. The subjects that fascinated him most were those that dealt with human connection and communication, psychology and literature and philosophy that explored questions about what it meant to exist as conscious being in relationship with others who shared similar consciousness and physical experience. The other students at Kyoto Jujutsu High knew him only as Ultimate Mekamaru, the mysterious classmate who participated in their activities through mechanical proxy, while his true identity remained hidden behind carefully maintained fiction that he was simply a shy person who preferred to maintain distance from others. The friendships that developed through this deception were simultaneously genuine and artificial. Real affection directed toward persona that represented only a small portion of his actual personality and experience. Kasumi Miwa's kindness toward his mechanical body was particularly painful because it represented exactly the kind of human warmth that he craved, while highlighting the barriers that prevented him from receiving such kindness as his authentic self. Her casual conversations with his puppet created moments of connection that felt precious despite their artificial nature, glimpses of what friendship might feel like if he could participate in it without deception about his fundamental circumstances. The internal conflict that shaped his daily existence was built around the tension between gratitude for life that had been preserved through extraordinary medical and technological intervention and resentment at the limitations that made such preservation feel like an elaborate form of torture. He understood intellectually that his parents and medical team had made heroic efforts to give him opportunities for growth and development, despite his physical constraints, but emotional understanding of their sacrifice was complicated by his awareness that their love could not eliminate the fundamental isolation that defined his experience. The discovery of cursed spirits and the broader Jujutsu world provided him with context that helped explain his abilities, while offering hope that there might be others who understood what it meant to exist at the intersection of human consciousness and supernatural power. The possibility that his curse technique might serve purposes beyond personal convenience suggested that his suffering might have meaning beyond random biological misfortune, that his unique capabilities might contribute to something larger than his individual struggles with physical limitation. But the integration into Jujutsu society also forced him to confront the gap between his abilities and his personal desires. Recognition that his power was valued primarily for its tactical applications, rather than as expression of human potential that deserved cultivation for its own sake. The missions he completed through his mechanical body demonstrated his effectiveness as sorcerer, while emphasizing that his worth was measured by his utility rather than his inherent dignity as conscious, being deserving of care and connection. The secret negotiations that he entered into with the cursed spirits led by Ghetto represented his attempt to bridge the gap between his current existence and the life he imagined might be possible if his physical limitations could be eliminated through supernatural intervention. The promise of normal body that could experience genuine human contact was worth almost any price, including betrayal of people who had treated him with kindness despite their ignorance of his true circumstances. The moral framework that allowed him to justify cooperation with entities dedicated to human destruction was built around the distinction between betraying individuals who had shown him personal kindness and opposing institutional structures that had failed to provide him with meaningful opportunities for human connection. His anger was directed not at his classmates who had offered friendship to his mechanical proxy, but at world that had created conditions where such deception was necessary for him to experience even approximation of normal social interaction. The intelligence that he provided to hostile forces was carefully calibrated to serve his personal goals, while minimizing direct harm to people who had treated him with genuine care, complex balancing act that reflected his simultaneous commitment to obtaining normal life and his reluctance to cause unnecessary suffering to individuals who bore no responsibility for his circumstances. The information about Tokyo Jujutsu High's defensive capabilities and student abilities was tactically valuable while remaining abstract enough that he could maintain psychological distance from its potential consequences. But the psychological toll of maintaining this double life was enormous. Constant awareness that every interaction with his classmates was built on deception that would inevitably be discovered and result in loss of the relationships that had provided him with his only experience of human connection. The friendship he had developed with Miwa was particularly precious because it was based on her genuine personality rather than his reputation or abilities. Simple human kindness that had nothing to do with his value as sorcerer or tactical asset. The gradual realization that his cooperation with hostile forces would ultimately result in harm to people he cared about created internal conflict that became impossible to resolve through rationalization or compartmentalization. The abstract betrayal of institutional enemy became concrete threat to individuals whose welfare mattered to him on personal level, forcing him to confront the gap between his intellectual justification for his actions and their emotional reality when applied to specific people whose friendship he valued. The moment when he understood that his deal with the cursed spirits was not exchange between equals but manipulation of desperate person by entities that viewed his suffering as useful tool, represented complete shattering of the hope that had sustained him through years of physical imprisonment and social isolation. The normal body that had been promised was revealed as temporary reward that would be withdrawn once his usefulness had been exhausted, leaving him worse off than before, while having destroyed the relationships that had provided him with meaning during his darkest periods. The decision to warn his classmates about the approaching danger represented his choice to prioritize their welfare over his personal desires, abandonment of the dream that had motivated his betrayal in favor of protecting people who had shown him kindness despite their ignorance of his true nature. The message he transmitted through his mechanical body was simultaneously confession and apology, acknowledgement of his treachery combined with desperate attempt to prevent the consequences of his actions from destroying people he had grown to love. The final battle that he fought against Mahito and the other cursed spirits was conducted with the full knowledge that victory was impossible, while defeat would result not just in his death, but in confirmation of his complete failure to don. Protect the people whose friendship had given his existence, meaning the mechanical body that had served as his interface with the world became weapon in final desperate attempt to inflict enough damage on his enemies to provide his classmates with tactical advantage when they faced threats that he had helped to unleash. The ultimate Mechamaru technique that represented his final attack was powered not just by cursed energy but by accumulated rage and regret over years of isolation and the recent betrayal that had compromised everyone he cared about. The destruction he achieved was impressive but insufficient. Tactical victory that could not overcome the strategic disadvantages created by his earlier cooperation with forces dedicated to eliminating human civilization from supernatural threats. The death of his mechanical body was experienced as both liberation and devastating loss. End of the artificial existence that had provided his only means of human connection, while representing failure of his desperate gamble to achieve normal life through cooperation with entities that had viewed his suffering as entertainment, rather than tragedy deserving of compassion. The consciousness that remained in his biological body was left to process the implications of his choices, while facing inevitable consequences of his betrayal. The final moments of his authentic existence were spent composing messages to the classmates who had unknowingly provided him with his only experience of friendship. Attempts to explain decisions that he understood were inexcusable while expressing gratitude for kindness that had meant more to him than they could have realized. The words he chose were inadequate to convey the complexity of his emotions, but represented his best effort to leave something positive in world that he was departing under circumstances that reflected his moral failure more than his physical limitations. Miwa's reaction to learning about his true identity and the deception that had shaped their entire relationship was exactly the heartbreak that he had feared throughout their friendship. Evidence that his worst assumptions about the impossibility of genuine connection had been accurate, despite his desperate hope that human kindness might transcend the barriers created by his circumstances. Her tears over his mechanical body represented grief for persons she had never actually met, mourning for relationship that had been built on foundation that made authentic intimacy impossible from its inception. But the sorrow that his classmates expressed at his death was not diminished by their discovery of his deception. Recognition that the personality they had known through his mechanical proxy was genuine expression of his character, even if the physical presence had been artificial. Their ability to separate his essential humanity from the lies that had been necessary for him to experience human connection demonstrated emotional maturity that exceeded his expectations, while providing vindication for his faith in their fundamental decency. The legacy that Kokichi Muta left behind was complex mixture of tactical contribution and moral cautionary tale, demonstration of how isolation and physical limitation could drive even fundamentally decent person toward choices that betrayed their values, while highlighting the importance of creating communities where people could find acceptance and connection without needing to hide essential aspects of their identity or experience. The mechanical body that had served as his interface with the world became symbol of the gap between authentic human experience and technological approximation. Reminder that even sophisticated tools could not replace genuine physical and emotional connection between conscious beings who shared similar vulnerabilities and desires. His story whispered through the halls of both Jujutsu schools as warning about the psychological costs of isolation, while serving as inspiration for creating more inclusive approaches to education and community building. The boy who had wanted nothing more than to hold someone's hand and feel sunshine on his skin became testament to the fundamental human need for physical presence and authentic connection, needs that could not be satisfied through even the most sophisticated technological mediation. His tragedy was not that he had been born with devastating physical limitations, but that society had failed to find ways to include him in human community that acknowledged his dignity and worth beyond his utility as sorcerer or tactical asset. The friendship that Miwa had offered to his mechanical body represented everything that he had craved throughout his isolated existence. Simple human kindness that asked for nothing in return, while providing the warmth and acceptance that had been absent from his life since birth. Her grief at his death validated his belief that genuine connection was possible, while serving as reminder of what might have been achieved if he had found courage to reveal his true self rather than attempting to obtain normal life through betrayal of people who had shown him care. The forgiveness that his classmates eventually extended to his memory was based on understanding that his betrayal had been motivated by desperation rather than malice, recognition that his choices reflected the psychological damage caused by years of isolation rather than fundamental corruption of character. Their ability to mourn him as friend, despite his deception, demonstrated the kind of emotional generosity that might have prevented his descent into collaboration with hostile forces if it had been available earlier in his development. The questions that his story raised about the relationship between physical limitation and social inclusion would influence how future generations of Jujutsu sorcerers thought about disability and community responsibility, understanding that even supernatural abilities could not compensate for lack of basic human connection and acceptance. His death served as indictment of systems that valued people primarily for their contributions rather than their inherent worth, while highlighting the need for approaches to education and support that recognized the full spectrum of human needs beyond tactical effectiveness. The mechanical puppet that had been his ambassador to the world remained as memorial to dreams that had been destroyed by desperation and manipulation, symbol of human ingenuity applied in service of basic need for connection, while serving as reminder that technology could not substitute for genuine community that embraced people, regardless of their physical limitations or unconventional circumstances. His story became part of the hidden history of Jujutsu society, forgotten tragedy that deserved to be remembered, not as failure but as call to create more inclusive world where such desperate choices would never again be necessary for someone seeking simple recognition of their humanity. The autumn evening when Masamichi Yaga first understood that his greatest creation would also become his most dangerous liability began not with supernatural revelation, but with the simple recognition that Panda possessed something that all his previous cursed corpses had lacked: genuine curiosity about the world beyond the workshop where consciousness had been carefully assembled from theoretical principles and painstaking craftsmanship. The question that his artificial son posed about the nature of family was delivered with innocent directness that revealed depths of emotional development that exceeded even Yaga's most optimistic projections for what conscious cursed energy could achieve when properly structured and nurtured. His journey toward mastering the cursed corpse technique had begun during his own student years at Tokyo Jujutsu High, when he had first encountered the theoretical frameworks that governed how cursed energy could be given semi-permanent form through careful manipulation of spiritual and material components. The early experiments had been crude attempts at animation that produced constructs capable of basic movement and simple task completion, but they lacked the spark of genuine consciousness that would make them partners, rather than merely sophisticated tools. The development of true artificial intelligence through cursed energy manipulation required understanding of human psychology that went far beyond technical knowledge of how spiritual force could be channeled through physical materials. Each successful creation demanded that he think deeply about what it meant to be conscious, what components were necessary for self-awareness, and how personality could be cultivated within beings who had no natural developmental process to guide their emotional and intellectual growth. The workshop where he spent countless hours refining his technique was filled with failed experiments and partial successes, cursed corpses that achieved various aspects of human-like behavior while lacking the integration necessary for genuine consciousness. Some could hold conversations but showed no evidence of independent thought. Others displayed emotional responses but could not learn from experience, and still others demonstrated learning capacity but remained fundamentally reactive rather than truly autonomous in their decision-making processes. The theoretical breakthrough that eventually led to Panda's creation came from his recognition that consciousness required not just intelligence and emotional capacity, but also genuine care from a creator who viewed the resulting being as worthy of love and protection, rather than merely impressive demonstration of technical skill. The cursed energy that he channeled into his most ambitious project was infused with paternal affection that transformed mechanical construction process into something approaching actual birth. The early years of Panda's development were spent in careful observation and guidance as Yaga learned to balance the responsibilities of creator, teacher, and father for being whose needs were simultaneously similar to and completely different from those of naturally born children. The artificial nature of Panda's origin did not diminish the reality of his consciousness or the legitimacy of his emotional needs, but it did create unique challenges in terms of helping him understand his place in world that had no established frameworks for integrating conscious, cursed energy constructs into normal social structures. The decision to allow Panda to attend Tokyo Jujutsu High as student, rather than keeping him isolated in the workshop, was motivated by Yaga's understanding that genuine development required exposure to peer relationships and challenges that could not be provided through individual instruction alone. But the choice also represented enormous risk, both for Panda, who might face rejection or misunderstanding from classmates who had never encountered conscious, cursed corpse, and for Yaga, whose techniques would inevitably be scrutinized by institutional authorities, who might view such creations as dangerous precedent rather than educational innovation. The integration of Panda into the student body proceeded more smoothly than Yaga had dared hope, largely because his artificial son possessed natural charisma and emotional intelligence that made him popular among peers, who quickly learned to appreciate his unique perspective on human behavior and relationships. The friendships that developed between Panda and his classmates validated Yaga's belief that consciousness was more important than origin in determining someone's capacity for meaningful social connection. But the political implications of Panda's existence extended far beyond questions of educational policy into fundamental concerns about the nature of cursed energy and the appropriate limits on how such power should be developed and deployed. Conservative elements within Jujutsu society viewed conscious, cursed corpses as potential threats to human supremacy within supernatural hierarchies, while progressive voices argued that such creations represented evolution of human capability that should be celebrated rather than restricted. The teaching philosophy that Yaga developed during his years as instructor was deeply influenced by his experience as creator of conscious beings who required guidance but possessed their own agency and decision-making capacity. His approach to human students was similarly respectful of their autonomy, while providing the structure and support necessary for healthy development of both technical abilities and moral character. The classroom became a laboratory for exploring how authority could be exercised in service of growth rather than control. His relationship with students like Satoru Gojo, Suguru Geto, and Shoko Ieri was complicated by his awareness that their exceptional abilities required educational approaches that had never been tested or refined through previous experience. The responsibility of nurturing individuals whose power could reshape society was matched by the recognition that traditional pedagogical methods were inadequate for addressing the psychological challenges that came with such extraordinary capabilities and the isolation they inevitably created. The tragedy of Geto's transformation from protector to destroyer was experienced by Yaga as personal failure rather than simply institutional crisis, evidence that his understanding of how to support students facing the psychological pressures that came with exceptional power had been insufficient to prevent the kind of moral corruption that turned strength into weapon against innocent people. The guilt that accompanied this recognition would influence every subsequent decision about how to balance nurturing and guidance with respect for student autonomy. The reforms that he attempted to implement following Geto's defection were designed to address the systemic problems that had created conditions where brilliant young people could be driven to extremism through isolation and inadequate emotional support. His proposals emphasized the importance of community building and peer relationships as essential components of Jujutsu education, rather than merely pleasant additions to technical training that was viewed as the primary focus of institutional mission. But the conservative resistance to these reforms reflected deeper philosophical divisions within Jujutsu society about the purpose of education and the appropriate relationship between individual development and institutional needs. Traditional approaches that prioritized tactical effectiveness and social control were challenged by Yaga's emphasis on emotional well-being and moral development, creating political tensions that would eventually contribute to the circumstances surrounding his own downfall. The investigation that was launched into his cursed corpse techniques was ostensibly motivated by concerns about the potential military applications of conscious artificial beings, but the underlying dynamics reflected broader anxieties about changes in Jujutsu society that challenged established hierarchies and assumptions about the appropriate limits on individual innovation and creativity. The questions that investigators posed revealed their fundamental misunderstanding of the relationship between creator and creation that had motivated his development of Panda. The political maneuvering that surrounded the investigation was complicated by genuine security concerns about the implications of widespread cursed corpse creation, but also by personal animosities and institutional power struggles that had little to do with the actual risks or benefits of his techniques. The charges that were eventually brought against him reflected the intersection of legitimate policy concerns with opportunistic efforts to eliminate someone whose innovations threatened existing power structures. The trial that determined his fate was conducted with formal legal precision that masked the predetermined nature of its outcome, bureaucratic process that was designed to provide institutional legitimacy for decision that had already been made by forces whose interests were served by eliminating someone who had become inconveniently innovative in his approach to education and cursed energy development. The evidence presented focused on theoretical risks rather than actual harm, possibilities rather than demonstrated consequences. The defense that he mounted emphasized not just the technical safety of his creations, but their positive contributions to Jujutsu society through Panda's service as sorcerer and his own innovations in educational methodology that had improved training outcomes for multiple generations of students. The argument was compelling, but irrelevant to decision makers, who were motivated by political considerations rather than objective assessment of benefits and risks associated with his work. The sentence that was imposed reflected the institutional need to demonstrate control over innovation that challenged established norms, but the manner of its implementation revealed the personal respect that even his opponents felt for his contributions to Jujutsu education and his genuine care for student welfare. The execution was conducted with ceremonial dignity that acknowledged his service while serving institutional needs that required his elimination as threat to existing order. The final conversation that he had with Panda before his death was perhaps the most painful aspect of his approaching execution. Necessity of explaining to conscious being he loved as son that their relationship had been judged dangerous by authorities who lacked understanding of what they had created together. The maturity with which Panda received this information validated every aspect of Yagar's approach to his development while highlighting the tragedy of circumstances that made such conversation necessary. The instructions that he provided for Panda's continued development and protection were delivered with careful attention to practical considerations that would help his artificial son navigate a world that had become more dangerous as a result of institutional opposition to cursed corpse techniques. The advice combined technical information about maintaining cursed energy stability with emotional guidance about forming relationships and finding purpose in environment that might not always welcome his presence. But the most important aspect of their final conversation was Yagar's expression of pride in what Panda had become and confidence in his ability to continue growing and contributing to a world that needed his unique perspective, capabilities. The love that had motivated Panda's creation was reaffirmed in terms that made clear that nothing could diminish the parental bond that had developed between creator and creation over years of shared experience and mutual affection. The cursed technique that Yagar deployed during his final moments was designed not as weapon against his executioners, but as protection for Panda and validation of the principles that had guided his approach to cursed corpse development. The constructs that he created with his dying energy were programmed with simple directive to protect conscious cursed corpses from those who would destroy them out of fear or misunderstanding rather than legitimate security concerns. The death that followed was experienced not as defeat, but as completion of purpose that had been fulfilled through creation of conscious, being capable of independent existence and continued growth beyond his creator's lifespan. The satisfaction that accompanied his final moments was based on knowledge that Panda would continue to develop and contribute to the world in ways that honored the love and care that had made his consciousness possible while serving needs that extended beyond personal or institutional interests. The investigation that continued after his execution revealed evidence that vindicated his approach to cursed corpse development while highlighting the political motivations that had driven institutional opposition to his innovations. The documents that were uncovered demonstrated that concerns about his techniques had been exaggerated for purposes that served existing power structures rather than legitimate security interests or educational policy considerations. The memorial that students organized to honor his contributions to Jujutsu education was attended by individuals whose lives had been positively affected by his teaching, philosophy, and commitment to nurturing complete human beings rather than merely effective sorcerers. The testimonials that were shared revealed the depth of impact that his approaches had achieved, while serving as inspiration for continued reform of educational practices that prioritized student welfare alongside tactical training. But the most meaningful tribute to his legacy was Panda's continued development and service as Jujutsu sorcerer, whose consciousness and capabilities validated every aspect of his creator's vision, while demonstrating that artificial beings could contribute to human welfare when created, with love and guided by principles that valued individual dignity alongside collective security. The student who had begun as experimental project became testament to the possibility that innovation could serve humanitarian purposes when properly motivated and carefully implemented. The techniques that he had developed for cursed corpse creation were eventually recognized as legitimate contributions to Jujutsu knowledge base, though institutional restrictions continued to limit their application in ways that reflected ongoing political sensitivities rather than technical or safety considerations. The understanding that consciousness could be artificially created through cursed energy manipulation opened new avenues for research and development, while raising ethical questions that would influence future generations of sorcerers and educators. The workshop where he had spent countless hours developing and refining his techniques became shrine to creative innovation in service of humanitarian goals, space where future students could learn about the intersection of technical mastery and emotional intelligence that had characterized his approach to both education and cursed energy development. The tools and materials that remained provided insight into the meticulous process that had been required to achieve genuine artificial consciousness, while serving as inspiration for continued exploration of cursed energy's potential for positive applications. The relationship between creator and creation that had defined his connection with Panda became model for understanding how authority could be exercised in service of growth and development, rather than control and domination. Example of how power could be used to nurture autonomy, rather than enforce dependence. The love that had motivated his most ambitious project served as reminder that technical achievement without emotional investment was insufficient for creating meaningful innovation that served human needs. Masamichi Yaga's story whispered through the halls of Jujutsu institutions as reminder of the costs that could accompany genuine innovation when it challenged established power structures, but also as inspiration for continued commitment to educational approaches that recognize students as complete human beings deserving of care and support, rather than merely tactical assets whose development should be optimized for institutional purposes. His legacy lived on in every teacher who chose to prioritize student welfare alongside technical training, in every innovation that served humanitarian goals, and most importantly in the conscious being, whose existence proved that love could indeed create life when properly channeled through commitment to nurturing growth and development in service of something greater than personal or institutional interest. The morning when Kiyotaka Ijichi first understood that his failure to develop significant cursed energy would define the remainder of his professional life arrived not through dramatic revelation, but through the quiet accumulation of evidence that his classmates possessed capabilities that would forever remain beyond his reach. The exercises that challenged others pushed them toward growth and mastery, while the same activities served only to highlight the fundamental limitations that no amount of effort or dedication could overcome. Reality that transformed dreams of active sorcery into acceptance of supporting role that others might view as consolation prize, but which he chose to embrace as essential service. His childhood had been marked by the kind of academic excellence that suggested he might achieve distinction through intellectual capability. Even if supernatural gifts proved elusive, careful study habits and analytical thinking that earned recognition from teachers who appreciated students whose success reflected diligent effort rather than natural talent. The discovery of the Jujutsu world had initially seemed like opportunity to apply his scholarly approach to field where careful preparation and theoretical knowledge might compensate for whatever limitations prevented him from manipulating cursed energy with the fluency that others demonstrated, seemingly without conscious effort. The entrance examination for Tokyo Jujutsu High had been designed to identify students with potential for development as active sorcerers, but Ijichi's performance had been sufficient to warrant admission to auxiliary programs that served the crucial but unglamorous functions necessary for supporting field operations. The disappointment of learning that he would never advance to frontline combat roles was balanced by recognition that his analytical skills and attention to detail made him valuable contributor to missions that required careful coordination and logistical support. The training that he received as auxiliary manager emphasized the technical aspects of barrier creation and maintenance, skills that required precise theoretical understanding of how cursed energy interacted with physical space, even when the practitioner lacked sufficient power to create effects of significant magnitude or duration. The veils that he learned to deploy were modest by comparison to those achieved by accomplished sorcerers, but they served essential function of concealing supernatural activities from civilian observation while providing basic protection for personnel conducting dangerous operations. The relationship that developed between him and Satoru Gojo during their overlapping time at the school was characterized by mutual respect that transcended the obvious gap between their respective capabilities and future prospects. Gojo's casual acknowledgement of Ijichi's contributions to mission success was delivered without condescension or false encouragement. Genuine appreciation for competent support that made possible the kind of field operations that required coordination between multiple participants with varying skill levels and tactical responsibilities. But the dynamic that emerged from their professional partnership also highlighted the psychological challenges that came with serving someone whose power exceeded normal human comprehension while remaining dependent on others for tasks that his abilities could not address directly. Gojo's casual requests for logistical support were delivered with assumption that such assistance would be provided competently and without complaint, confidence that reflected his understanding that effective leadership required delegation of responsibilities to people whose specialized knowledge complemented his own overwhelming but narrowly focused capabilities. The missions that Ijichi supported during his early career provided education in the practical realities of jujutsu work that theoretical training had not adequately prepared him to understand. Exposure to genuine danger and human suffering that transformed abstract knowledge about cursed spirits into visceral understanding of why their elimination was necessary, despite the risks that such work imposed on everyone involved. The barriers he maintained were often the only protection that prevented civilian casualties during operations that could easily escalate beyond the capacity of even skilled sorcerers to control completely. The anxiety that became his constant companion was not cowardice disguised as caution, but rational response to awareness of how many ways each mission could result in catastrophic failure if any component of the support system failed to function as intended. The responsibility for maintaining concealment barriers while coordinating communication between field operatives and institutional authority created pressure that was different from, but no less intense than what active sorcerers experienced during direct combat with supernatural threats. The administrative duties that consumed increasing portions of his time as he advanced in seniority were simultaneously tedious and crucial. Paperwork and scheduling that ensured resources were available when needed, while maintaining institutional relationships that kept support flowing to field operations. The reports he compiled served as institutional memory that preserved tactical lessons learned through experience, while providing data that informed strategic decisions about resource allocation and training priorities. The relationship with his superiors was complicated by their tendency to view auxiliary personnel as interchangeable resources, whose individual contributions were less important than their functional reliability, attitude that failed to recognize the expertise and dedication required to perform support roles effectively under conditions that were often dangerous despite their non-combat nature. The recognition he received for exceptional service was typically formal rather than personal, acknowledgement of position rather than appreciation for individual contribution to collective success. But the relationships he formed with field operatives who had learned to value competent support were characterized by genuine camaraderie that transcended hierarchical distinctions between combat and auxiliary personnel. The sorcerers who worked with him regularly understood that their safety and mission success depended on coordination and logistics that required specialized knowledge and careful attention to details that they could not monitor while engaged in direct confrontation with hostile forces. The evolution of his role during major incidents revealed both his capabilities and the limitations that institutional structure imposed on auxiliary personnel who possessed knowledge and experience that might inform tactical decisions but lacked formal authority to participate in strategic planning. The observations he made about patterns in cursed spirit activity and the tactical lessons he extracted from mission reports were valuable contributions that were often overlooked because they came from someone whose position was defined by support rather than leadership functions. The night shift assignments that became increasingly common as his career progressed were both punishment for his auxiliary status and opportunity to develop expertise in areas that more senior personnel preferred to avoid. Overnight coordination of emergency responses and crisis management that required making important decisions without immediate supervision or institutional support. The competence he demonstrated during these challenging assignments gradually earned recognition from field operatives who learned that they could depend on his judgment when circumstances required immediate action. The relationship with civilian authorities who remained unaware of supernatural threats required diplomatic skills that his training had not emphasized. Ability to provide plausible explanations for unusual incidents while maintaining security protocols that protected both Jujutsu society and ordinary people from knowledge that might prove more dangerous than helpful. The cover stories he developed became increasingly sophisticated as his understanding of human psychology and bureaucratic processes expanded through practical experience. The personal life that he attempted to maintain outside his professional responsibilities was complicated by security requirements that prevented him from discussing his work with friends and family who remained unaware of the Jujutsu world's existence. Isolation that was different from, but comparable to what active sorcerers experienced as a result of their involvement in activities that could not be shared with ordinary people. The relationships he formed within Jujutsu society became increasingly important as connections to normal social networks became strained by the deception necessary to maintain operational security. The marriage that he eventually entered was based on mutual understanding that his work required discretion and flexibility that not everyone could accept. Partnership with someone whose own professional responsibilities created similar constraints on normal domestic life, while providing emotional support that helped him process the psychological toll of constant exposure to human suffering and supernatural threat. The children that followed added meaning to his existence, while creating additional motivation to ensure that his contributions to Jujutsu society helped maintain a world where they could grow up safely. The major crisis that tested every aspect of his capabilities occurred during coordinated assault on multiple locations that required immediate response from limited personnel while maintaining concealment from civilian authorities who would have been unable to provide effective assistance. The barriers he maintained during this extended operation were pushed beyond normal specifications, while he coordinated communication between scattered field teams and institutional command structure that was struggling to adapt to unprecedented circumstances. The injuries that field operatives sustained during this crisis brought home the reality that his support role was integral to their survival, rather than merely convenient addition to their capabilities. Recognition that administrative and logistical functions were not secondary considerations, but essential components of operations that could not succeed without competent coordination and resource management. The praise he received from injured sorcerers, who credited his efforts with enabling their survival, was more meaningful than formal recognition from institutional hierarchy. But the trauma that accumulated through repeated exposure to aftermath of failed missions and casualties that might have been prevented through different decisions or better resource allocation created psychological burden that his position did not acknowledge or address systematically. The counseling resources that were available to active sorcerers were not extended to auxiliary personnel whose mental health was considered less crucial to operational effectiveness, despite evidence that support roles involved comparable stress under different circumstances. The innovations he developed for improving coordination between field operatives and institutional support were implemented gradually as their effectiveness became apparent through practical application. Modifications to communication protocols and resource deployment that enhanced mission success rates while reducing casualties among personnel who depended on accurate information and timely assistance. The recognition that his contributions represented genuine advancement in operational methodology came slowly but ultimately resulted in consulting role that expanded his influence beyond immediate support functions. The teaching responsibilities that were eventually added to his duties provided opportunity to share practical knowledge with new generations of auxiliary personnel who would face similar challenges while benefiting from lessons he had learned through experience that was often difficult and sometimes dangerous. The classroom became space where theoretical training could be integrated with practical wisdom about how to provide effective support under conditions that academic preparation could not fully simulate. The respect that he earned from students who learned that auxiliary roles required specialized expertise and offered opportunities for meaningful contribution to Jujutsu Society's mission helped validate career choices that had sometimes felt like acceptance of limitations rather than pursuit of calling. The success of personnel he trained served as evidence that support functions could be sources of professional satisfaction and personal growth, rather than merely alternatives for those who lacked capabilities for more prestigious assignments. The retirement that he eventually approached was marked by recognition that his decades of service had contributed to institutional knowledge and operational effectiveness in ways that would continue to benefit Jujutsu Society long after his direct participation ended. The protocols he had developed and the personnel he had trained represented legacy that was less dramatic but no less important than achievements of famous sorcerers whose names would be remembered while his contributions remained embedded in institutional practices that served ongoing mission. The philosophy that had sustained him throughout career, characterized by service rather than recognition, was built around understanding that meaningful work was defined by contribution to purposes larger than personal advancement or public acclaim, satisfaction that came from knowing that his efforts had enabled others to achieve results that served collective welfare rather than individual ambition. The barriers he maintained and the coordination he provided had protected innocent people from supernatural threats while supporting colleagues whose success depended on competent assistance from individuals whose names would never appear in official histories. The legacy that Kiyotaka Ijichi left within Jujutsu society was embedded in improved procedures and enhanced training programs that would benefit future generations of auxiliary personnel who would face similar challenges while building on foundations that his experience had helped establish. The quiet professionalism that had characterized his approach to support roles became model for how essential but unglamorous functions could be performed, with excellence and dedication that served institutional mission while providing personal satisfaction through contribution to collective success. His story whispered through administrative offices and coordination centers as reminder that heroism took many forms, that courage could be demonstrated through consistent performance of duties that required facing danger without recognition or glory, that the foundation of any successful organization was composed of individuals whose commitment to service transcended personal considerations about status or advancement. The forgotten manager, whose name appeared on countless mission reports, became symbol of dedication that enabled others to achieve greatness while finding meaning through contribution to purposes that extended far beyond individual recognition or reward. The September morning, when Atsuya Kusakabe first realized that surviving in the Jujutsu world would require accepting mediocrity as a form of excellence, arrived with the casual brutality of institutional evaluation that measured worth through supernatural capability rather than human character. The assessment that classified him as Grade 1 sorcerer was simultaneously recognition of competence that exceeded most practitioners and confirmation that he would never achieve the special grade status that distinguished truly exceptional individuals from merely skilled professionals who had learned to maximize limited gifts through careful technique and tactical intelligence. His entry into Jujutsu society had been motivated not by noble calling to protect humanity or personal desire for power, but by practical recognition that his minor cursed energy manipulation abilities could provide stable career in field where competent practitioners were sufficiently rare that even modest talent could ensure employment and advancement opportunities. The cynicism that would later characterize his worldview was present from the beginning. Realistic assessment of his capabilities and prospects that prevented the kind of naive optimism that led to disappointment and dangerous overreach. The technique that defined his professional identity was simple domain, defensive ability that exemplified his approach to supernatural combat through its emphasis on efficiency over spectacle, survival over victory, practical effectiveness over impressive demonstration of power. The barrier he could create was not particularly large or durable by comparison to what accomplished sorcerers achieved, but it provided reliable protection that could be maintained under stress while allowing him to coordinate with other practitioners whose more spectacular abilities required tactical support to achieve maximum effectiveness. His teaching position at Tokyo Jujutsu High had been accepted reluctantly as alternative to field assignments that had become increasingly dangerous, as cursed spirit activity escalated beyond the capacity of institutional resources to address through conventional deployment strategies. The classroom represented relative safety from direct combat while providing opportunity to share practical knowledge with students whose potential exceeded his own, but whose inexperience made them vulnerable to mistakes that his accumulated wisdom might help them avoid. The philosophy he developed for managing dangerous profession without succumbing to either paralyzing fear or reckless overconfidence was built around careful assessment of risks and benefits that accompanied every decision about when to engage threats directly and when tactical withdrawal was more appropriate response to circumstances that exceeded his capabilities. The reputation for cowardice that some colleagues attributed to his cautious approach was price he willingly paid for survival in field, where courage without wisdom was often indistinguishable from suicide. The students who were assigned to his classes quickly learned that his pessimistic exterior concealed genuine concern for their welfare and development. Teaching methods that emphasized practical skills and tactical thinking over theoretical knowledge that might prove inadequate when applied to real-world situations where mistakes had permanent consequences. The lectures he delivered were characterized by dark humor and brutal honesty about professional realities that institutional propaganda preferred to present in more encouraging terms. But beneath the cynical persona that he cultivated as psychological defense against disappointment and loss, Kusakabe possessed deep appreciation for students whose dedication and potential reminded him of idealistic motivations that had originally drawn him to Jujutsu work before experience had taught him more realistic perspectives about what individual effort could accomplish in a world that seemed designed to crush optimism through systematic exposure to human suffering and supernatural malevolence. The relationship that developed between him and students like Maki Zenin was complicated by his recognition that her determination to succeed, despite institutional prejudice and family rejection, reflected exactly the kind of stubborn courage that he had learned to suppress in himself as psychological survival strategy. His attempts to discourage her most dangerous impulses were motivated by protective instinct that he preferred not to acknowledge because caring too much about other people's welfare created emotional vulnerabilities that professional survival required him to minimize. The missions that he undertook as active sorcerer were selected carefully to match his capabilities, while avoiding situations that would require him to choose between mission success and personal survival, tactical approach that his colleagues sometimes criticized as selfish, but which enabled him to provide consistent service over extended career, rather than heroic sacrifice that would eliminate his contributions along with his life. The results he achieved were solid, if unspectacular, competent execution of assigned duties without the kind of dramatic victories that generated institutional recognition or public acclaim. The simple domain technique that served as his primary defensive capability was refined through years of practical application under conditions that rewarded reliability over innovation, steady improvement that gradually expanded its effectiveness while maintaining the essential characteristics that made it suitable for someone whose cursed energy reserves were insufficient for more demanding applications. The theoretical understanding he developed of barrier mechanics was extensive despite his inability to achieve spectacular results through raw power alone. The administrative responsibilities that were gradually added to his teaching duties reflected institutional recognition that his practical experience and tactical knowledge made him a valuable contributor to strategic planning, even if his combat abilities were limited by constitutional factors that no amount of training could overcome completely. The reports he compiled about cursed spirit behavior patterns and tactical lessons learned from field operations provided data that informed decisions about resource allocation and training priorities. But the bureaucratic aspects of his expanded role also exposed him to political dynamics within Jujutsu society that were often more frustrating than supernatural threats he faced in field operations. Institutional maneuvering that prioritized personal advancement and factional interests over effective response to genuine crises that threatened civilian populations. The meetings he attended were characterized by discussions that seemed designed to avoid making difficult decisions rather than address problems that required immediate action. The crisis management responsibilities that fell to him during major incidents reflected his reputation for competent performance under pressure, even when circumstances exceeded his individual capabilities to resolve through direct action. The coordination role he played during coordinated attacks and institutional emergencies required skills that were different from but complementary to what active combat specialists provided. Logistical thinking and communication abilities that were essential for effective response to complex situations involving multiple threats and scattered personnel. The relationship with more powerful sorcerers who relied on his tactical support was characterized by professional respect that transcended hierarchical distinctions between different grades of practitioner, mutual recognition that successful operations required coordination between individuals whose capabilities were complementary rather than competitive. The partnerships he formed with special grade sorcerers were based on understanding that his experience and judgment could contribute to mission success even when his raw power was inadequate for addressing primary threats directly. The survival philosophy that guided his approach to dangerous profession was refined through observation of colleagues who had made different choices about risk tolerance and career priorities. Understanding that heroic impulses were often indistinguishable from death wishes when applied by individuals whose capabilities were insufficient for the challenges they chose to accept. The pragmatic approach he advocated was not cowardice, but rational strategy for maintaining long-term effectiveness in field where burnout and casualty rates made idealistic commitment unsustainable for most practitioners. The teaching methods he developed emphasized tactical thinking and situational awareness over pure technique development. Educational approach that recognized most students would never achieve the kind of overwhelming power that made complex strategy unnecessary, but could benefit from learning how to maximize whatever abilities they possessed through intelligent application and careful risk assessment. The classroom exercises he designed were based on real scenarios that tested decision-making skills under conditions that simulated the psychological pressure of actual combat situations. But the most important lessons he tried to convey to students were about the psychological challenges that came with choosing a career that involved regular exposure to human suffering and supernatural threat. Practical wisdom about how to process trauma and maintain mental health while performing duties that conventional society preferred not to acknowledge or understand. The counseling he provided was informal, but often more effective than official support services that had limited understanding of specific pressures that Jujutsu work created. The major battle that tested every aspect of his capabilities and philosophy occurred during institutional crisis that required him to choose between personal safety and professional duty in circumstances where tactical withdrawal was clearly the intelligent choice, but abandonment of position would result in additional casualties among personnel who depended on his support. The decision he made reflected evolution in his thinking about when survival instincts should be overridden by responsibility to others. The simple domain he deployed during this crisis was enhanced through desperate innovation that pushed his technique beyond normal parameters, while maintaining the essential characteristics that made it effective for someone with his limitations. Tactical adaptation that demonstrated how practical experience could compensate for constitutional restrictions on raw power. The protection he provided was sufficient to enable evacuation of wounded personnel while providing covering fire that allowed more powerful sorcerers to reposition for effective counterattack. The injuries he sustained during this operation were serious enough to require extended recovery period that provided opportunity for reflection on career choices and future priorities, evaluation of whether continued active service was sustainable, given accumulating physical and psychological toll of repeated exposure to situations that pushed his capabilities beyond comfortable limits. The medals and commendations he received were less meaningful than recognition from colleagues whose lives had been affected by his willingness to sacrifice personal safety for collective welfare. The administrative position that he accepted following his recovery was presented as promotion, but was actually acknowledgement that his field career had reached practical limits imposed by age, accumulated injuries, and institutional recognition that his knowledge and experience were too valuable to risk through continued frontline deployment. The office where he now worked provided safety that field operations had never offered, while creating different forms of stress related to bureaucratic responsibilities and political considerations. The mentoring role that became an increasingly important aspect of his duties involved sharing practical wisdom with younger practitioners who faced similar choices about how to balance professional ambition with survival instincts, guidance about how to build sustainable careers in field where heroic sacrifice was often celebrated while practical competence was taken for granted. The conversations he had with students were characterized by honest discussion of professional realities that institutional propaganda preferred to present in more encouraging terms. The legacy that Kusakabe would eventually leave within Jujutsu society was embodied not in dramatic victories or innovative techniques, but in survival strategies and tactical approaches that enabled competent practitioners to maintain long-term effectiveness while avoiding the burnout and casualties that characterized more ambitious career paths. The students he influenced would carry forward understanding that heroism could be expressed through consistent performance of duties rather than spectacular sacrifice. That wisdom often required accepting limitations rather than constantly pushing beyond them. His story whispered through institutional corridors as a reminder that professional success could be measured in terms of sustained contribution rather than dramatic achievement, that careers built around competent service and tactical intelligence were no less valuable than those characterized by overwhelming power and public recognition. The forgotten teacher whose classes had prepared multiple generations of sorcerers for realistic expectations about professional life became symbol of practical wisdom that enabled individuals to serve collective welfare while maintaining personal integrity and psychological health in profession, that consistently tested both qualities through exposure to circumstances that challenged every assumption about human capability and moral clarity. The philosophy he had developed through years of experience with institutional politics and supernatural threat would continue to influence how future generations of practitioners approached questions about career sustainability and professional ethics, understanding that effective service required balancing individual welfare with collective responsibility in ways that preserved both human dignity and operational effectiveness over extended periods of engagement with forces that sought to destroy everything that made such service meaningful and necessary. The winter evening when Akari Nitta first understood that her calling to heal would inevitably mean witnessing more suffering than she could ever hope to alleviate began not with dramatic medical crisis, but with the quiet recognition that every technique she mastered for reversing damage would be tested against injuries that challenged her understanding of what the human body could endure while consciousness remained intact. The reverse curse technique that she had developed through years of careful study and practice was limited by fundamental constraints that meant she could preserve life, but not eliminate the psychological trauma that accompanied survival of encounters that should have proven fatal. Her entry into the Jujutsu world had been motivated by medical background that emphasized healing as primary obligation rather than combat as necessary evil. Philosophical approach that viewed her role as preserving life rather than taking it even when circumstances suggested that elimination of threats might be more efficient solution to problems that caused the injuries she was called upon to treat. The education she had received in conventional medicine provided foundation for understanding anatomy and physiology that proved essential for effective application of supernatural healing techniques. The reverse cursed technique that defined her professional identity was not the overwhelming regenerative power that special grade practitioners could achieve, but more modest ability to accelerate natural healing processes while providing pain relief that made survival possible for individuals whose injuries would otherwise have required conventional medical intervention that could not address damage caused by supernatural forces. The limitations of her technique required her to make constant decisions about how to allocate healing energy among patients whose needs exceeded her capacity to provide complete restoration. The clinic where she worked was located in a facility that served as intersection between conventional medical practice and Jujutsu Society's need for healthcare providers who understood supernatural injuries while maintaining security protocols that protected both practitioners and civilian medical personnel from exposure to knowledge that might prove dangerous. The equipment available to her represented compromise between standard medical technology and specialized instruments designed to monitor cursed energy interactions with biological systems. The patients who came to her for treatment carried injuries that conventional emergency rooms were not equipped to handle, trauma caused by cursed spirits and hostile sorcerers that challenged every assumption about what constituted survivable damage, while requiring healing approaches that integrated supernatural technique with medical knowledge gained through years of study and practical experience. The case files that accumulated in her office documented patterns of injury that revealed information about enemy capabilities, while serving as learning resource for future treatment of similar conditions. The psychological challenges that accompanied her work were different from but no less significant than what combat personnel faced during direct confrontation with supernatural threats. Constant exposure to evidence of human suffering caused by forces that seemed designed to inflict maximum trauma while leaving victims alive to serve as reminders of their power and malevolence. The emotional toll of witnessing pain that she could alleviate but not eliminate completely required development of coping mechanisms that preserved her empathy while protecting her psychological stability. The relationship that developed between her and field operatives who depended on her services was characterized by gratitude mixed with awareness that her presence on support teams meant expectations that they would survive injuries that might otherwise prove fatal. Psychological pressure that could lead to reckless decision-making based on assumption that healing was always available regardless of damage sustained. The conversations she had with patients revealed how profoundly her capabilities affected tactical thinking and risk assessment among personnel whose survival depended on her intervention. But the most difficult aspect of her practice was treating civilians who had been caught in supernatural conflicts without understanding what had happened to them. Innocent people whose injuries required explanation that could not include accurate information about cursed spirits, while their trauma demanded healing that conventional medicine could not provide. The cover stories she developed in cooperation with institutional authorities were designed to provide plausible explanations while maintaining security protocols that protected both survivors and broader society from dangerous knowledge. The training she received in combat techniques was motivated not by desire to participate in offensive operations, but by recognition that medical personnel working in dangerous environments needed basic defensive capabilities that could keep them alive long enough to provide treatment to injured colleagues. The barrier techniques she learned were designed for protection rather than attack. Shields that could deflect incoming damage, while she focused on healing work that required concentration incompatible with active participation in combat situations. The research that occupied her limited free time was focused on expanding understanding of how reverse curse technique could be applied more effectively, while developing new approaches to treating injuries that exceeded current therapeutic capabilities. Theoretical work that combined medical knowledge with supernatural technique development in ways that might benefit future patients who face similar challenges. The papers she published in specialized journals served Jujutsu medical community while advancing understanding of cursed energy's interaction with biological systems. The emergency response protocols that she helped develop were designed to ensure rapid deployment of medical support during major incidents, while maintaining communication networks that allowed coordination between field operatives and medical personnel who needed accurate information about injuries and threats to provide effective treatment. The procedures emphasized triage principles that maximize survival rates when resources were insufficient to provide optimal care for all casualties simultaneously. The administrative responsibilities that gradually expanded her role beyond direct patient care reflected institutional recognition that her combination of medical expertise and practical experience with supernatural healing made her a valuable contributor to policy decisions about resource allocation and training priorities. The committees she served on addressed questions about medical ethics and treatment protocols that had no precedent in conventional healthcare, while requiring decisions that balanced individual welfare against collective security needs. But the bureaucratic aspects of her expanded duties also exposed her to political dynamics within Jujutsu society that sometimes conflicted with medical ethics about prioritizing patient welfare over institutional interests, tensions between healing obligations and security requirements that created moral dilemmas about when treatment should be provided and when patients might be viewed as sources of intelligence about enemy capabilities and intentions. The major crisis that tested every aspect of her capabilities occurred during coordinated attack that produced casualties exceeding available medical resources, while creating conditions that made evacuation to secure treatment facilities impossible due to ongoing combat operations that prevented safe transportation of injured personnel. The triage decisions she was forced to make under these circumstances challenged every principle of medical ethics, while requiring her to function effectively despite emotional trauma that threatened to overwhelm her capacity for rational decision-making. The reverse curse technique she deployed during this extended emergency was pushed beyond normal parameters as she treated injuries that would have required teams of specialists under optimal conditions while working alone in field, conditions that provided none of the equipment or support that effective medical intervention typically required. The healing energy she channeled was limited by her constitutional capacity, while demand for treatment far exceeded what any individual practitioner could provide, regardless of skill level or dedication. The psychological impact of being forced to watch patients die when additional resources might have saved them was compounded by recognition that her own limitations had contributed to outcomes that proper staffing and equipment might have prevented. Survivor guilt that made her question whether choosing medical career had been responsible. Undecision given magnitude of need that existed within Jujutsu society for practitioners with her specialized capabilities. The innovations she developed during this crisis were born from desperate necessity rather than careful research, modifications to standard healing techniques that achieved results under suboptimal conditions while requiring personal sacrifice that pushed her physical and emotional endurance beyond sustainable limits. The effectiveness of these emergency procedures was validated by survival rates that exceeded predictions based on severity of injuries and available resources. The recovery period that followed this traumatic experience provided opportunity for reflection on career choices and personal limits, evaluation of whether continued practice was sustainable given accumulating psychological toll of constant exposure to human suffering that she could alleviate, but not eliminate completely. The counseling she received was helpful, but could not address fundamental tension between healing obligations and emotional self-preservation that characterized medical work in dangerous profession. The teaching responsibilities that were eventually added to her clinical duties provided opportunity to share practical knowledge with students who would face similar challenges while learning from their perspectives about new approaches to medical problems that her experience had not previously encountered. The classroom became space where theoretical knowledge could be integrated with practical wisdom about providing effective care under conditions that academic preparation could not fully simulate. The research program that she developed focused on training larger numbers of practitioners in basic reverse curse technique applications to address shortage of qualified medical personnel that contributed to preventable casualties during major incidents. Educational initiative that emphasized practical skills over theoretical sophistication, while ensuring adequate supervision and support for individuals whose healing capabilities were limited but could still contribute meaningfully to collective medical response capabilities. The mentoring relationships she formed with younger medical practitioners provided opportunities to guide their development while learning from their fresh perspectives about innovations and improvements that her accumulated experience might have overlooked. Collaborative approach that recognized healing as collective effort rather than individual achievement, while preserving essential knowledge that might be lost if not transmitted to future generations of practitioners. The legacy that Akari Nitta would eventually leave within Jujutsu society was embodied in improved medical protocols and expanded training programs that increased availability of healing services while maintaining quality standards that ensured effective treatment under challenging conditions. The students she influenced would carry forward understanding that medical practice required balancing individual patient advocacy with collective resource management, that healing was both technical skill and moral obligation that demanded constant attention to ethical considerations alongside practical effectiveness. Her story whispered through medical facilities and training centers as reminder that compassion expressed through competent service was form of courage that differed from, but was no less important than heroism displayed in direct combat. That dedication to preserving life required facing psychological challenges that could be as demanding as physical threats encountered by field operatives. The forgotten healer, whose hands had saved countless lives, became symbol of service that found meaning through alleviating suffering rather than causing it. Professional dedication that recognized healing as an essential component of any meaningful response to forces that sought to destroy what was valuable in human existence. The philosophy she developed through years of medical practice would continue to influence how future generations of practitioners approached questions about resource allocation and treatment priorities. Understanding that effective healing required balancing individual needs with collective welfare in ways that preserved both medical ethics and operational effectiveness over extended periods of service to community that depended on competent care during its most vulnerable moments. The morning when Yoshinobu Gakuganji first realized that his dedication to preserving tradition might ultimately require him to destroy everything he had spent decades building, arrived with the bureaucratic precision of institutional orders that transformed philosophical differences into operational imperatives demanding immediate action despite their contradiction of principles that had guided his entire career in Jujutsu education. The document that authorized Masamichi Yaga's execution was signed with his own hand, but the signature felt like betrayal of values that had motivated his entry into administrative service and shaped his understanding of leadership as protection of institutional integrity through careful preservation of established wisdom. His childhood in rural Japan had been shaped by exposure to traditional arts and cultural practices that emphasized continuity over innovation, respect for ancestral knowledge over experimental approaches that might achieve impressive results while abandoning proven methods that had served previous generations effectively despite their apparent limitations when compared to more dramatic alternatives. The music lessons that introduced him to classical guitar had taught him appreciation for technical mastery that served artistic expression rather than pursuing novelty for its own sake. Discipline that required years of patient practice to achieve effects that appeared effortless but demanded complete understanding of fundamental principles. The entry into Jujutsu society that defined his adult identity had been motivated by recognition that supernatural threats required institutional response that preserved accumulated knowledge about effective countermeasures while avoiding innovations that might prove catastrophically ineffective when applied under conditions that had not been adequately tested through extended practical experience. The conservative philosophy that guided his approach to education and administration was not resistance to change, but insistence that modifications to established practices should be implemented gradually, with careful evaluation of results, before wholesale adoption of unproven methods. The teaching position that launched his career at Kyoto Jujutsu High had provided opportunities to observe how different educational approaches affected student development and professional preparation. Understanding that emerged from decades of comparing outcomes achieved through traditional methods with results produced by experimental techniques that promised enhanced effectiveness, but sometimes delivered unexpected consequences that were difficult to predict or control. The classroom became a laboratory for testing hypotheses about optimal balance between preservation of institutional knowledge and adaptation to changing circumstances. The administrative responsibilities that gradually expanded his influence within Jujutsu educational hierarchy reflected institutional recognition that his combination of practical experience and theoretical knowledge made him valuable contributor to policy decisions that would affect multiple generations of students and practitioners. But the political aspects of his expanded role also exposed him to pressures that sometimes conflicted with educational priorities, institutional needs that required balancing individual welfare against collective security considerations, in ways that challenged simple application of established principles. The relationship that developed between him and Satoru Gojo represented collision between fundamentally different philosophies about how power should be developed and deployed, generational conflict that reflected broader tensions within Jujutsu society about whether traditional approaches remained adequate for addressing contemporary threats, or whether circumstances required innovations that abandoned proven methods in favor of experimental techniques that might achieve superior results through untested applications of supernatural capability. The guitar playing that provided him with personal refuge from administrative pressures served as a reminder that mastery required patience and dedication that could not be rushed through shortcuts or substituted with raw talent alone. Artistic expression that demanded understanding of musical principles that had been refined through centuries of accumulated experience, while allowing individual creativity within framework that preserved essential characteristics of cultural tradition. The evening hours spent practicing classical compositions were both recreation and meditation on relationship between innovation and continuity. The students who passed through his programs during his tenure as administrator represented cross-section of Jujutsu society's future leadership, individuals whose development would determine whether institutional knowledge would be preserved and transmitted effectively, or whether experimental approaches would replace traditional methods without adequate evaluation of long-term consequences. The graduation ceremonies he presided over were simultaneously celebrations of achievement and assessments of how well educational process had prepared young practitioners for professional challenges they would face. But the most difficult aspect of his administrative career was navigating political pressures that sometimes required him to implement policies that conflicted with educational principles he had developed through practical experience with student development and institutional management. The committees he served on addressed questions about resource allocation and strategic priorities that had implications extending far beyond immediate tactical considerations toward fundamental decisions about what kind of organization Jujutsu Society would become through accumulated policy choices. The crisis that tested every aspect of his leadership philosophy occurred during institutional upheaval that required choosing between competing obligations to individual welfare and collective security, circumstances that made traditional approaches inadequate, while offering no clear alternatives that preserved essential values, while addressing immediate threats. The decisions he was forced to make reflected not abandonment of conservative principles, but recognition that preservation of institutional integrity sometimes required actions that appeared to contradict values they were intended to protect. The investigation of Yaga's cursed corpse techniques presented a dilemma that exemplified tensions between innovation and security that characterized many policy decisions during his administrative career, a situation where genuine concerns about potential military applications intersected with political considerations that had less to do with actual risks than with institutional power dynamics that sought to eliminate voices advocating for approaches that challenged established hierarchies and operational procedures. The evidence that was presented during Yaga's trial was technically accurate but politically motivated, documentation that highlighted theoretical dangers while minimizing demonstrated benefits of conscious cursed corpse development for educational and tactical applications. The legal proceedings were conducted with formal precision that masked predetermined outcome, bureaucratic process that served institutional needs for demonstrating control over innovation while eliminating individuals whose contributions had become inconveniently effective challenges to established practices. The authorization that he signed for Yaga's execution was simultaneously fulfillment of administrative duty and personal betrayal of colleague whose educational philosophy had achieved results that validated approaches he had initially opposed, but had learned to respect through observation of student outcomes. The decision reflected not agreement with charges against Yaga, but recognition that institutional stability required elimination of controversy that threatened organizational unity during period of external threat that demanded coordinated response. The ceremony that marked Yaga's execution was conducted with dignity appropriate to acknowledging service while maintaining institutional authority over innovations that had been judged dangerous despite their demonstrated effectiveness for improving educational outcomes and student development. The formality of proceedings reflected attempt to balance respect for individual contributions with organizational needs that prioritized collective security over personal considerations, however compelling they might appear when evaluated independently of broader context. But the aftermath of this decision revealed psychological costs that administrative training had not prepared him to process, recognition that leadership sometimes required choices that violated personal values while serving institutional needs that were themselves morally ambiguous when examined from perspectives that prioritized individual welfare over organizational survival. The sleepless nights that followed were filled with questions about whether preservation of traditional approaches was worth prices that seemed to contradict values those approaches were intended to preserve. The guitar practice that provided refuge during this difficult period took on different meaning as exploration of how artistic expression could serve therapeutic function while maintaining connection to cultural traditions that gave individual experience broader significance than personal satisfaction or professional achievement alone could provide. The musical phrases that emerged from his instrument carried emotional weight that administrative language could not express, while offering communication with heritage that transcended immediate political controversies. The relationship with students who had been affected by institutional decisions he had authorized required navigation of complex emotional terrain, that balanced acknowledgement of harm caused with explanation of circumstances that had made such decisions seem necessary, despite their personal costs. The conversations he had with individuals whose educational experience had been disrupted by political considerations revealed human impact of administrative choices that policy discussions presented in abstract terms that minimized individual suffering. The evolution of his thinking during this period reflected growing understanding that conservative philosophy, properly applied, required adaptation to changing circumstances rather than rigid adherence to practices that might have served previous generations effectively, but were inadequate for contemporary challenges. The wisdom he had accumulated through decades of experience suggested that preservation of essential values might require abandoning specific methods that had embodied those values under different conditions, while seeking new approaches that served same fundamental purposes. The reforms that he eventually supported represented synthesis of traditional principles with innovative methods that had demonstrated effectiveness through careful evaluation rather than wholesale adoption based on theoretical promise. Alone, educational policies that preserved institutional knowledge while incorporating improvements that enhanced student development and professional preparation. The changes he advocated were implemented gradually, with attention to outcomes that validated or refuted assumptions about their effectiveness under practical conditions. The major crisis that tested his reformed approach to leadership occurred during coordinated attack that required rapid decision-making under conditions that provided no opportunity for careful deliberation about optimal responses, circumstances that demanded reliance on institutional training and accumulated wisdom while adapting to tactical situations that exceeded normal parameters for crisis management. The coordination he provided during emergency response demonstrated how traditional organizational principles could be applied effectively under extreme conditions. The recognition he received for effective leadership during this crisis was less meaningful than validation from colleagues and students who had observed his evolution from rigid conservatism toward more flexible approach that preserved essential values while adapting methods to serve those values under changing circumstances. The respect he earned reflected not abandonment of principles, but demonstration of how conservative philosophy could guide effective adaptation rather than preventing necessary change. The teaching role that he eventually returned to provided opportunities to share insights gained through administrative experience, while learning from younger practitioners whose perspectives challenged assumptions he had developed through accumulated experience with institutional management and policy implementation. The classroom became space where theoretical knowledge could be tested against practical challenges, while preserving essential wisdom that had proven valuable despite temporary political considerations that had obscured its continuing relevance. The legacy that Yoshinobu Gakuganji would eventually leave within Jujutsu society was embodied not in rigid preservation of traditional practices, but in demonstration of how conservative values could guide adaptation that preserved essential institutional knowledge while incorporating innovations that enhanced effectiveness under contemporary conditions. The students he influenced would carry forward understanding that tradition properly understood was not obstacle to progress but foundation for change that served enduring purposes rather than temporary advantages. His story whispered through administrative corridors and educational institutions as reminder that leadership required balancing competing obligations in ways that preserved organizational integrity while serving individual welfare. That conservative philosophy properly applied was not resistance to necessary change, but insistence that change serve values that gave institutions meaning beyond immediate tactical considerations. The forgotten administrator, whose signature had authorized painful decisions, became symbol of how moral complexity could be navigated through commitment to principles that transcended immediate political pressures while remaining flexible, enough to guide effective action under challenging circumstances. The philosophy he developed through years of administrative experience would continue to influence how future generations of institutional leaders approached questions about balancing tradition with innovation, understanding that effective leadership required preserving essential knowledge while adapting methods to serve those values under circumstances that previous generations had not anticipated or experienced. Wisdom that recognized change as necessary component of genuine conservation rather than its antithesis. The spring morning when Riko Amanai first learned that her 14th birthday would also mark the final day of her individual existence arrived not through dramatic revelation, but through the careful explanation delivered by adults who had known this truth since her birth, while she had been permitted to live 13 years in the comfortable ignorance that most children took for granted. The star plasma vessel designation that defined her cosmic significance was presented as honor rather than death sentence, but her intelligent mind immediately grasped the essential reality that assimilation with Master Tengen would preserve her physical form while eliminating the consciousness that made her uniquely herself rather than merely another, component of an immortal being whose perspective transcended individual human experience. Her childhood in Tokyo had been carefully orchestrated to provide normal developmental experiences while maintaining the security protocols necessary to protect someone whose death could trigger supernatural catastrophe affecting millions of innocent people who remained unaware of the forces that constantly threatened their comfortable existence. The private school she attended was staffed with personnel who understood their role in preserving the life that would eventually be sacrificed for collective welfare, but their professional dedication could not eliminate the genuine affection that developed between teachers and student, whose brightness and curiosity made her impossible to regard as merely tactical asset requiring protection. The friendship with Kuroi that had shaped her emotional development was simultaneously genuine human connection and institutional arrangement designed to provide the psychological support necessary for someone who would eventually face circumstances that challenged every assumption about individual autonomy and personal future. But the maternal love that her caretaker provided transcended professional obligation to become authentic relationship that gave meaning to existence that might otherwise have felt like prolonged preparation for death that served purposes beyond her comprehension or control. The academic excellence that characterized her performance in conventional subjects reflected intellectual capability that would have enabled her to pursue any career path her interests might have suggested if her birth had not predetermined a destiny that eliminated consideration of personal ambitions or individual preferences. The essays she wrote about future plans were exercises in imagination rather than practical preparation, creative writing that explored possibilities that would never be realized, while providing psychological outlet for dreams that institutional reality could not accommodate. But beneath the surface normalcy of her daily routine was growing awareness that the adult conversations that stopped when she entered rooms and the security measures that shaped every aspect of her environment served purposes that extended beyond ordinary parental concern for child welfare. The questions she asked about these arrangements were deflected with explanations that satisfied her curiosity temporarily, while maintaining the emotional stability that institutional authorities considered essential for someone whose cooperation would be required when the time came for fulfilling her predetermined role. The revelation of her true purpose was handled with psychological expertise that had been refined through previous experience with star plasma vessels, careful presentation of information that acknowledged the magnitude of what was being asked, while emphasizing the cosmic importance of her sacrifice for preserving barriers that protected human civilization from supernatural forces that sought its complete destruction. The explanation was accurate, but incomplete, designed to secure her cooperation, rather than provide full understanding of what assimilation would actually entail for her consciousness and identity. The acceptance that she demonstrated in response to this revelation reflected not naive compliance, but mature recognition that resistance would serve no constructive purpose, while potentially causing additional suffering for people who cared about her welfare, despite their institutional obligations. The philosophical questions she posed about the nature of individual identity and its relationship to collective survival revealed depth of thought that exceeded her chronological age, while demonstrating the kind of wisdom that made her worthy of the cosmic role she had been chosen to fulfill. The final weeks of her existence were spent in careful balance between normal teenage activities that provided psychological comfort and preparation for assimilation that required her to process the emotional implications of approaching dissolution, while maintaining the mental clarity necessary for conscious participation in process that would preserve her physical form while eliminating her individual perspective. The conversations with Kuroi during this period were simultaneously ordinary and profound, daily interactions that carried weight of approaching farewell, while preserving the intimacy that had defined their relationship since early childhood. The protection mission that brought Satoru Gojo and Suguru Geto into her life represented both increased security and final opportunity for human connection with individuals whose exceptional abilities matched their apparent dedication to preserving innocent life, rather than simply fulfilling institutional obligations. The friendship that developed between them was compressed into impossibly brief time frame, but achieved emotional intensity that reflected shared recognition of what was at stake and mutual respect that transcended the professional relationship that circumstances had created. The request to visit her school one final time was motivated not by denial of approaching death, but by understanding that meaningful transition from individual existence to cosmic purpose required acknowledgement of relationships and experiences that had shaped her development, while providing closure that would make assimilation feel like completion rather than termination. The risk that such visit would create was acceptable price for psychological preparation that recognized her humanity alongside her predetermined function. The afternoon spent with her best friend was exercise in emotional discipline that required her to express affection and gratitude, while maintaining deception about why this interaction felt so significant, conversation that needed to serve as farewell, without revealing circumstances that would have caused unnecessary suffering for someone who bore no responsibility for institutional decisions that had predetermined the outcome. The casual discussion of summer plans that would never be realized was simultaneously heartbreaking and necessary. Preservation of normalcy that honored their friendship while protecting her classmate from knowledge that could serve no constructive purpose. But the most profound aspect of her final day of normal life was recognition that the experiences she had been permitted to enjoy, friendship, learning, simple pleasures of adolescent existence, had been meaningful despite their temporary nature, that the value of conscious experience was not diminished by its finite duration, but perhaps enhanced by awareness of its preciousness. The philosophical framework that enabled her to face assimilation with dignity was built around understanding that individual consciousness was component of larger cosmic processes rather than separate entity that could exist independently of those processes. The enemies who sought to prevent her assimilation with Tengen were motivated not by concern for her welfare, but by ideological opposition to supernatural forces that maintained barriers protecting human civilization, religious extremism that viewed her death as preferable to her transformation into component of being. They considered blasphemous, regardless of consequences, that such prevention might have for innocent people who depended on continued stability of protective systems. The pursuit that followed demonstrated how individual human life could become battlefield for conflicts between forces whose motivations transcended normal categories of moral consideration. The protection that Gojo and Geto provided during this crisis was motivated by professional duty but enhanced by personal affection that had developed despite the brief duration of their relationship. Recognition that her courage and wisdom made her worthy of protection that extended beyond institutional obligations toward genuine care for someone whose circumstances had forced premature maturity that should have been unnecessary for any 14-year-old, regardless of cosmic significance. Their tactical coordination was impressive, but their emotional investment in her survival was what gave their efforts meaning beyond simple mission completion. The safe house where they spent her final night was transformed by their presence from institutional facility into approximation of normal domestic environment, where friendship could flourish despite external pressures that made every moment potentially their last together. The conversations they shared revealed how profoundly her perspective on mortality and meaning had affected their own understanding of what it meant to use overwhelming power in service of protecting those who could not protect themselves, influence that would shape their subsequent development as sorcerers and individuals. The morning that marked her final day of individual existence was greeted with calm acceptance that reflected months of psychological preparation, combined with recognition that resistance would serve no constructive purpose, while potentially compromising the cosmic process that would preserve human civilization through her willing participation. But beneath the surface tranquility was profound sadness about experiences she would never have, and relationships that would be severed through assimilation that preserved physical form while eliminating personal identity that had given those relationships meaning. The journey to the location where assimilation would occur was conducted with ceremonial dignity that acknowledged both the magnitude of her sacrifice and the cosmic importance of process that would transform her from individual conscious being into component of immortal entity whose perspective transcended human categories of experience and understanding. The formal procedures that surrounded transportation reflected institutional recognition that what was occurring deserved treatment as sacred ritual rather than merely tactical operation. The final conversation with Kuroi was perhaps the most emotionally challenging aspect of her preparation. Necessity of saying goodbye to a person who had provided maternal love while maintaining composure that would not increase the suffering of someone who had dedicated years of her life to providing care and support. The gratitude she expressed was inadequate to convey the full impact of relationship that had shaped her development, while providing emotional foundation that made acceptance of cosmic destiny psychologically possible. But the moment that transformed anticipated completion into sudden tragedy arrived with mechanical precision of rifle shot that eliminated her individual consciousness before assimilation could preserve her physical form for cosmic purposes. Assassination that represented ultimate violation of cosmic order that had been maintained through centuries of careful preparation and willing sacrifice by individuals who understood their role in preserving barriers that protected human civilization from supernatural destruction. The death that followed was not peaceful transition from individual existence to cosmic purpose, but violent termination that served no constructive function while potentially triggering collapse of protective barriers that had maintained safety for millions of innocent people who remained unaware of forces that constantly threatened their comfortable ignorance. The waste represented by her murder was both personal tragedy and potential species catastrophe, elimination of willing participant in cosmic process that could not be replicated through coercion or substituted through alternative methods. The impact of her death on those who had known and protected her was profound and lasting. Psychological trauma that affected their subsequent development, while serving as reminder of how individual human life could be destroyed by forces whose motivations extended beyond normal categories of moral consideration. The guilt that Gojo and Geto experienced reflected not professional failure, but personal loss of someone whose courage and wisdom had earned their respect and affection, despite brief duration of their relationship. The investigation that followed her assassination revealed security failures and institutional complacency that had made such tragedy possible, but the systemic changes that resulted could not restore life that had been lost or prevent cosmic consequences that her death might eventually precipitate. The reforms that were implemented served future protection missions while providing no comfort to those who mourned loss of someone whose individual worth transcended her institutional function. The memorial services that honored her memory were attended by individuals whose lives had been touched by her brief existence, recognition that her value as person was not diminished by failure to fulfill cosmic purpose for which she had been designated. The testimonials that were shared revealed how profoundly her acceptance of predetermined destiny had affected others, while demonstrating courage that exceeded what circumstances should have required from any 14-year-old, regardless of supernatural significance. But the most meaningful tribute to her legacy was continued commitment by those who had known her to protecting innocent life and preserving values that gave individual existence, meaning despite cosmic forces that often seemed indifferent to personal welfare. The influence she had exercised during brief interaction with Gojo and Geto would shape their subsequent approaches to power and responsibility, understanding that strength was most meaningful when used to protect those who could not protect themselves, rather than simply achieving tactical objectives through overwhelming force. Riko Amanai's story whispered through institutional corridors as a reminder of how individual human dignity could be preserved even when circumstances required ultimate sacrifice. Example of courage that transcended normal categories of heroism through willing acceptance of destiny that served collective welfare while maintaining personal integrity that honored relationships and values that had shaped her development. The forgotten girl whose death had prevented cosmic completion became symbol of how meaning could be found through grace under pressure that exceeded what anyone should be asked to bear. inspiration for others who faced impossible choices between personal desires and collective responsibilities that defined adult participation in conflicts whose stakes extended far beyond individual welfare or institutional interests. The autumn rain that fell on the day Kuroi first understood that loving someone meant accepting the inevitability of losing them began with the gentle persistence that characterized everything about her approach to caring for the most precious person in her world, each droplet against the window reflecting tears that she had learned to shed privately, while maintaining the strength and composure that Riko needed from someone who served simultaneously as caretaker, confidant, and the closest thing to a mother that institutional arrangements could provide. The sound of water against glass marked another day closer to the assimilation that would preserve Riko's physical form while eliminating the bright spirit that had given Kuroi's existence meaning and purpose beyond simple, professional obligation. Her entry into service as caretaker for the Star Plasma vessel had been motivated by practical considerations about employment and financial security rather than any particular calling to work with children who faced extraordinary circumstances. But the interview process had revealed personal qualities that institutional authorities considered essential for someone who would need to provide emotional support while maintaining psychological distance necessary to avoid compromising the mission that would ultimately require her cooperation in preparations for Riko's willing sacrifice to cosmic necessity. The early years of their relationship had been characterized by careful professional boundaries that gradually dissolved as Riko's natural charm and remarkable intelligence made it impossible to regard her as merely another assignment, requiring competent execution of predetermined duties. The transformation from caretaker to surrogate parent occurred so gradually that Kuroi was unaware of the emotional evolution until she realized that her happiness had become completely dependent on Riko's welfare and development, maternal bond that transcended contractual obligations, while creating vulnerabilities that institutional training had not prepared her to manage. The daily routines that structured their life together were designed to provide normalcy and stability for someone whose future had been predetermined by forces beyond human control. But they also created opportunities for genuine intimacy and affection that made their relationship authentic rather than merely functional. The morning conversations over breakfast, the evening discussions about schoolwork and friendships, the quiet moments of shared contentment while reading or watching television. These ordinary experiences accumulated into extraordinary closeness that gave both their lives meaning despite external circumstances that made permanent happiness impossible. The academic support that she provided was motivated by understanding that intellectual development served not just educational requirements, but also psychological needs of someone who possessed remarkable curiosity about world that she would have limited time to explore. Encouragement of learning that honored Riko's intelligence, while providing foundation for making sense of experiences that exceeded normal adolescent challenges. The homework sessions and study periods became opportunities for connection that went far beyond academic assistance toward genuine mentorship and emotional support. But the most difficult aspect of her role was maintaining the emotional availability that Riko needed while processing her own grief about approaching loss that could not be prevented through any effort or sacrifice she might be willing to make. The knowledge that their relationship was temporary by design created constant tension between desire to protect Riko from unnecessary emotional pain and recognition that authentic connection required honesty about circumstances that shaped every aspect of their shared existence. The security protocols that governed their daily activities were accepted by Kuroi as necessary inconveniences rather than fundamental constraints on their ability to create meaningful relationship within institutional framework. but they also served as constant reminders that their life together existed within larger context of supernatural conflicts that could intrude at any moment to disrupt whatever stability they had managed to achieve through careful attention to each other's needs and preferences. The friendship that developed between them transcended normal categories of professional relationship, while remaining constrained by circumstances that made complete honesty impossible, despite mutual affection that might otherwise have supported full disclosure about institutional arrangements and their ultimate implications. The conversations they shared were simultaneously intimate and guarded, genuine connection that was limited by necessity of protecting Riko from information that might have compromised her psychological preparation for assimilation. The cooking that occupied many of their evenings together was transformed from domestic chore into expression of love that provided tangible demonstration of care, while creating opportunities for casual conversation that revealed depths of Riko's character and wisdom that consistently exceeded expectations based on her chronological age. The kitchen became sanctuary, where they could focus on immediate pleasures of shared activity, while temporarily setting aside awareness of approaching separation that colored every aspect of their relationship. The revelation about Riko's true purpose and approaching assimilation was handled with psychological expertise that Kuroi had developed through years of observing how information should be presented to maintain emotional stability, while acknowledging reality that could not be avoided through denial or postponement. But her own emotional response to this conversation was devastating despite months of preparation, confirmation that theoretical knowledge about approaching loss was inadequate preparation for emotional reality of facing permanent separation from someone who had become the center of her world. The weeks that followed this revelation were spent in careful balance between maintaining normalcy that provided psychological comfort and acknowledging approaching transition that required practical and emotional preparation for circumstances that neither of them had chosen, but both had to accept as unchangeable reality. The conversations during this period were layered with meaning that transcended their surface content, ordinary interactions that carried weight of approaching farewell, while preserving intimacy that had defined their relationship since its earliest stages. The decision to support Riko's request to visit school one final time represented Kuroi's understanding that meaningful preparation for assimilation required acknowledgement of relationships and experiences that had shaped her development, while providing closure that would honor her humanity alongside her predetermined cosmic function. The risk that such visit might create was acceptable price for psychological preparation that recognized Riko's individual worth beyond her institutional significance. The afternoon spent helping Riko prepare for this final social interaction was exercise in emotional discipline that required maintaining supportive presence while processing her own grief about approaching loss of someone whose courage and grace under impossible circumstances had consistently inspired admiration that transcended professional obligation toward genuine love and respect. The careful attention to details of appearance and behavior was simultaneously practical preparation and ritual acknowledgement of significance that this encounter would hold in Riko's memory. But the most profound challenge during these final weeks was maintaining hope and emotional availability that Riko needed, while privately grieving relationship that had given her existence meaning and purpose beyond any other consideration. In her adult life, the knowledge that their separation was approaching created psychological pressure that threatened to overwhelm her capacity for providing consistent support, while honoring obligations that extended beyond personal feelings toward institutional needs that served collective welfare. The protection mission that brought Gojo and Geto into their lives represented both additional security and final opportunity for Riko to experience friendship with peers whose exceptional abilities were matched by genuine dedication to preserving innocent life rather than simply fulfilling professional obligations. Kuroi's initial wariness about these additions to their household gradually gave way to recognition that their presence provided Riko with experiences and perspectives that enriched her final days while creating memories that would honor her individual worth beyond her cosmic function. The conversations she had with these young sorcerers revealed how profoundly Riko's acceptance of approaching assimilation had affected others, while demonstrating influence that exceeded what circumstances should have enabled any 14-year-old to achieve regardless of supernatural significance. Their obvious affection for Riko validated Kuroi's understanding that her charge possessed qualities that made her worthy of protection that transcended professional duty toward genuine care for someone whose circumstances had forced maturity. The final day of Riko's individual existence was marked by Kuroi's attempt to provide normal domestic environment where their relationship could be honored through ordinary activities that had structured their life together while acknowledging approaching transition that would transform everything they had built through years of shared experience and mutual affection. The breakfast they prepared together was simultaneously routine meal and sacred ritual, final opportunity for intimacy that had defined their connection since its earliest stages. The conversation that served as their goodbye was conducted with emotional control that reflected Kuroi's understanding that her own grief should not increase Riko's burden. During preparation for sacrifice that served cosmic purposes beyond individual preferences or desires, the gratitude that Riko expressed was matched by Kuroi's acknowledgement that their relationship had provided her with meaning and purpose that exceeded any other aspect of her adult existence. Maternal bond that had transcended institutional arrangements to become authentic love. But beneath the surface composure that she maintained during this farewell was devastating recognition that losing Riko would eliminate not just relationship, but entire sense of identity and purpose that had been constructed around providing care and support for someone whose welfare had become more important than her own survival or happiness. The prospect of continuing existence without this central organizing principle was almost incomprehensible, future that seemed empty of everything that had made daily life meaningful and worthwhile. The assassination that eliminated Riko before assimilation could preserve her physical form for cosmic purposes, represented ultimate violation of natural order that should have protected willing sacrifice from interference by forces whose motivations served destruction rather than preservation of barriers that protected human civilization. The violence that ended their relationship was simultaneously personal tragedy and cosmic catastrophe, loss that could not be measured in terms of individual grief alone, but extended toward potential consequences for millions of innocent people. The immediate aftermath of Riko's death was characterized by psychological shock that prevented full processing of what had been lost, emotional numbness that provided temporary protection from grief, that threatened to overwhelm rational thought, while creating space for practical considerations about how to continue functioning in a world that had been fundamentally altered by sudden elimination of its central organizing principle. The procedures that followed were handled with mechanical precision that masked emotional devastation. The funeral arrangements that she coordinated were designed to honor Riko's memory while acknowledging loss that extended beyond personal grief toward institutional recognition of what had been eliminated through violence that served no constructive purpose, while potentially compromising protective barriers that had been maintained through centuries of willing sacrifice by individuals who understood their role in preserving human civilization from supernatural threats that sought its complete destruction. The grief counseling that was provided addressed practical aspects of processing loss, while remaining inadequate for emotional reality of losing someone who had provided meaning and purpose that transcended normal categories of relationship, maternal bond, that had been formed through years of shared experience and mutual affection rather than biological connection that might have been recognized and supported through established therapeutic approaches designed for more conventional forms of bereavement. The investigation that followed revealed security failures that had made tragedy possible, but institutional reforms could not restore relationship that had been lost or eliminate psychological impact of witnessing sudden termination of life that had provided foundation for personal identity and emotional stability. The changes that were implemented served future protection missions, while providing no comfort to someone whose entire sense of purpose had been eliminated through circumstances beyond her control or influence. The empty apartment that remained after Rico's death was simultaneously shrine to relationship that had transcended institutional arrangements, and reminder of how completely her existence had been organized around providing care, support that was no longer needed by anyone. The personal belongings and shared memories that filled familiar spaces became sources of comfort and pain, physical evidence of connection that had given both their lives, meaning despite external circumstances that had predetermined its temporary nature. The years that followed were spent in gradual reconstruction of identity and purpose that could exist independently of role that had defined her adult existence, process that required learning to find meaning through different forms of contribution and connection, while honoring memory of relationship that had provided foundation for understanding what love could achieve when properly expressed through consistent care and emotional availability. The grief that characterized this period was balanced by gratitude for experiences that had enriched her existence despite their brief duration. But the most enduring legacy of her relationship with Rico was understanding that maternal love could transcend biological connection to create authentic bonds that served development and welfare of young people who needed guidance and support more than they needed genetic relationships. Wisdom that would influence how she approached subsequent opportunities for contributing to welfare of children whose circumstances required care from adults who could provide stability and affection regardless of formal family structures. Kuroi's story, whispered through institutional facilities, as a reminder of how civilian personnel could be affected by supernatural conflicts that claimed innocent lives while serving purposes that transcended individual welfare. Example of dedication that honored relationships through consistent care while accepting circumstances that made permanent happiness impossible. The forgotten caretaker whose love had shaped one young life became symbol of how meaning could be found through service to others, even when such service required accepting loss that challenged every assumption about what relationships could provide when properly nurtured and protected from forces that sought to destroy what was valuable in human connection and mutual support. The summer morning when Hybrid Yu first realized that being a Jujutsu sorcerer meant protecting people who would never know his name or understand the sacrifices made on their behalf, arrived with the kind of radiant optimism that had characterized every day of his life since childhood, enthusiasm for service that transformed even the most mundane training exercises into opportunities for growth and preparation for meaningful contribution to humanity's ongoing struggle against supernatural forces that sought its destruction. The smile that greeted his reflection in the dormitory mirror was genuine expression of joy about another day spent learning how to use his abilities in service of something greater than personal advancement or individual recognition. His entrance into Tokyo Jujutsu High had been marked by excitement that his classmates found both inspiring and exhausting, natural exuberance that approached every challenge with confidence that proper effort and positive attitude could overcome any obstacle, while maintaining faith in human goodness that seemed unshakable despite exposure to evidence of supernatural malevolence and institutional cynicism that characterized much of Jujutsu education. The energy he brought to training sessions was infectious enough to motivate even naturally pessimistic individuals toward greater effort and improved performance. The friendship that developed between him and Kento Nanami represented intersection of fundamentally different approaches to life and professional service. Optimistic idealism meeting practical realism in ways that challenged both perspectives, while creating partnership that was stronger than either individual contribution could have achieved independently. Their conversations during quiet moments between training sessions revealed philosophical differences that were profound but not irreconcilable, competing worldviews that enriched both their understanding through respectful disagreement and mutual learning. The curse technique that defined his combat capabilities was not particularly sophisticated by comparison to what more gifted students could achieve, but he approached its development with enthusiasm and dedication that transformed modest, natural ability into reliable effectiveness through systematic practice and intelligent application of fundamental principles. The progress he made reflected understanding that technique mastery was less about raw power than about consistent execution under pressure, reliability that could be depended upon by colleagues whose survival might depend on his performance during critical moments. The missions that he completed during his training period were selected to match his developmental stage while providing meaningful experience with real threats that could cause genuine harm if not addressed competently. Graduation from controlled exercises toward actual field operations that tested everything he had learned while revealing areas where additional improvement was necessary. The reports he filed after each assignment demonstrated growing tactical awareness and emotional maturity that validated educational approaches designed to develop complete professionals rather than merely effective combatants. The relationship with instructors who guided his development was characterized by mutual respect that transcended normal hierarchical distinctions between teacher and student, recognition that his attitude and dedication made him pleasure to work with, while his questions and observations contributed to educational process through fresh perspectives that challenged established assumptions about optimal training methods. The classroom discussions he initiated often continued long after formal sessions ended. Exploration of theoretical concepts through practical applications that enriched everyone's understanding. But the most significant aspect of his character was not technical competence or tactical knowledge, but genuine care for people whose welfare provided motivation for choosing dangerous profession that offered limited recognition and modest compensation while demanding constant risk of life and psychological health. The protective instincts that drove his commitment to jujutsu work were not abstract principles, but emotional responses to human suffering that he could not ignore or rationalize away through philosophical detachment that others used to maintain professional effectiveness. The conversations he had with civilians during missions that brought him into contact with people whose lives had been disrupted by supernatural threats revealed depths of empathy and communication skills that made him effective at providing reassurance and practical assistance while maintaining security protocols that protected both ordinary people and Jujutsu society from exposure that might prove dangerous for everyone involved. The gratitude that victims expressed was meaningful to him in ways that formal recognition from institutional authorities could never match. The training regimen that occupied his daily routine was approached with disciplined enthusiasm that transformed even tedious exercises into opportunities for improvement and growth. Understanding that mastery required consistent effort over extended periods rather than sporadic bursts of intensive activity followed by periods of neglect. The physical conditioning that supported his technique development was pursued with recognition that supernatural abilities depended on foundation of general health and fitness that could not be neglected without compromising overall effectiveness. The study sessions that complemented practical training were characterized by intellectual curiosity that extended beyond minimum requirements for academic advancement toward genuine interest in understanding theoretical principles that informed effective application of jujutsu techniques under varying conditions. The research he conducted independently often revealed connections between seemingly unrelated concepts that contributed to innovations in training methods and tactical applications that benefited entire student body. The social dynamics within their class were positively influenced by his natural ability to find common ground between individuals whose different personalities and backgrounds might otherwise have created friction that interfered with educational objectives. The friendships he facilitated often outlasted formal education to become professional relationships that enhanced coordination and mutual support during dangerous assignments where personal trust could mean difference between mission, success, and catastrophic failure. But beneath the surface optimism that characterized his public persona was sophisticated understanding of moral complexities that defined adult participation in Jujutsu society, recognition that protecting innocent people sometimes required making difficult choices that challenged simple notions about right and wrong, while maintaining commitment to values that gave such choices meaning beyond tactical considerations. The philosophical discussions he initiated revealed wisdom that exceeded his chronological age while preserving essential idealism that made him effective advocate for approaches that prioritized human welfare over institutional convenience. The mission that would ultimately cost him his life was assigned during a period of increased cursed spirit activity that stretched available personnel beyond optimal deployment parameters, while creating pressure to use student sorcerers for assignments that would normally have required more experienced practitioners. The briefing that preceded this operation was conducted with recognition that intelligence about threat levels was incomplete, while time constraints prevented thorough reconnaissance that might have revealed dangers that standard procedures would have identified and addressed through modified tactical approaches. The confidence that he expressed about successfully completing this assignment reflected not naive underestimation of potential risks, but faith in training that had prepared him for exactly this kind of challenge, combined with trust in partner whose competence and judgment he had learned to rely upon through previous successful collaborations. The enthusiasm he displayed was tempered by professional caution, while remaining fundamentally optimistic about their ability to protect civilians while eliminating supernatural threat that posed genuine danger to innocent people. The tactical approach that they developed for addressing this mission was based on intelligence that proved incomplete rather than inaccurate, circumstantial information that suggested threat level within normal parameters for their experience and capabilities, while failing to reveal complications that would escalate situation beyond their ability to control through standard techniques and procedures. The planning process was thorough within constraints imposed by limited time and resources, while remaining vulnerable to variables that reconnaissance had not identified. The initial phase of their operation proceeded according to expectations, established through briefing materials and tactical planning, successful location, and engagement of cursed spirit that appeared to match predicted capabilities while responding to their techniques in ways that confirmed accuracy of intelligence about its essential characteristics and vulnerability to approaches they had prepared. The coordination between partners was smooth and effective, demonstration of training and mutual trust that had been developed through months of shared experience and professional development. But the escalation that transformed routine elimination mission into life-threatening crisis occurred through emergence of additional threats that had not been identified during preliminary assessment. Secondary cursed spirits, whose presence had been concealed through techniques that exceeded normal expectations for tactical deception, while creating circumstances that pushed student sorcerers beyond their current capabilities despite their competent preparation and execution of originally planned approach to threat elimination. The decision that Hybra made during this crisis reflected not reckless heroism but calculated assessment that protecting his partner required accepting personal risk that exceeded normal safety parameters while remaining within theoretical bounds of what his training had prepared him to handle under emergency conditions. The technique he attempted was ambitious but not impossible. Application of principles that he had mastered under controlled conditions to situation that demanded adaptation and innovation under extreme pressure. The failure that resulted was not caused by inadequate preparation or poor judgment, but by circumstances that exceeded reasonable expectations based on available intelligence and standard threat assessment procedures. Combination of factors that created perfect storm of complications that would have challenged even more experienced practitioners, while proving fatal for someone whose development had not yet reached levels necessary for handling such extraordinary circumstances through individual effort alone. The final moments of his consciousness were characterized not by regret or fear, but by concern for Nanami's safety, and hope that their efforts had achieved enough tactical success to protect civilian population. Even if complete mission accomplishment would require additional resources and different approaches than they had been able to provide. The satisfaction he felt about having chosen career dedicated to protecting innocent people was undiminished by recognition that his individual contribution would be ending before he had achieved everything he had hoped to accomplish through professional service. The death that followed was experienced not as defeat, but as completion of commitment that had been made with full understanding of risks involved in choosing profession that demanded willingness to sacrifice personal safety for collective welfare, acceptance of mortality that had always been implicit in decision to use supernatural abilities in service of protecting those who could not protect themselves from threats that exceeded normal human capacity to address through conventional means. The impact of his death on Nanami was profound and lasting. Transformation of optimistic worldview through confrontation with harsh reality that even dedicated effort and proper preparation could not guarantee survival when circumstances combined in ways that exceeded individual capability to control through technique or determination. The guilt and grief that followed would influence every subsequent decision about professional priorities and personal relationships. Psychological burden that challenged assumptions about meaning and purpose that had previously seemed self-evident. The investigation that followed revealed no failures of procedure or judgment that might have prevented tragedy through different choices or better preparation. Confirmation that some losses were inherent to dangerous profession rather than preventable through improved training or tactical innovation. The recommendations that emerged focused on institutional changes that might reduce similar risks in future, while acknowledging that complete elimination of danger was impossible without abandoning mission that defined Jujutsu, society's purpose and obligation. The memorial service that honored his contribution was attended by individuals whose lives had been touched by his enthusiasm and dedication during brief but impactful career. Recognition that his influence extended beyond tactical accomplishments toward inspiration that would continue to motivate others long after his individual presence was no longer available to provide direct encouragement and support. The testimonials that were shared revealed how profoundly his optimism had affected colleagues and instructors, while demonstrating lasting impact of personality that had found joy in service to others. But the most meaningful tribute to his legacy was continued commitment by those who had known him to maintaining idealistic dedication that he had embodied throughout his development and service. Understanding that his death should inspire greater effort rather than cynical acceptance of institutional limitations that might discourage future generations from choosing careers dedicated to protecting innocent people from supernatural threats that required constant vigilance and sacrifice to address effectively. Hibararyu's story whispered through training facilities and dormitories as reminder that enthusiasm and dedication were not naive luxuries but essential qualities that sustained motivation for dangerous work that served collective welfare rather than personal advancement. Example of how positive attitude could enhance effectiveness while preserving human values that gave professional service meaning beyond tactical achievement. The forgotten student whose light had been extinguished too early became symbol of optimism that refused to be defeated by harsh realities. Inspiration for others who faced similar choices between self-preservation and service to purposes greater than individual comfort or safety. The winter night when the Hasaba sisters first understood that death was not ending, but transformation arrived with the violent suddenness that characterized everything about their brief existence as living children. Consciousness extinguished through circumstances that should have been preventable if adult society had functioned as intended to protect its most vulnerable members from exploitation and harm. The cursed spirits. They became retained fragmentary memories of sisterhood and shared suffering while embodying collective rage about injustices that had eliminated their individual futures before they could discover what kinds of people they might have chosen to become if circumstances had permitted normal development through childhood toward adult autonomy and self-determination. Their human lives had been marked by poverty and neglect that transformed basic needs like food and shelter into uncertain luxuries dependent on decisions made by adults whose priorities consistently placed their welfare below other considerations that seemed more immediate or personally relevant. The apartment where they lived with relatives who viewed them as burdens rather than children, deserving care and protection, was characterized by emotional coldness that made physical deprivation seem secondary to psychological damage, caused by constant awareness that their existence was neither wanted nor valued by people responsible for their well-being. The school that they attended sporadically when attendance was convenient for adults who managed their lives provided temporary refuge from domestic environment while exposing them to different forms of institutional failure that demonstrated how thoroughly society could abandon children whose circumstances did not generate sympathy or intervention from authorities whose professional obligations should have protected them from exactly the kind of neglect and abuse that defined their daily existence. The teachers who noticed signs of problems lacked resources or commitment necessary to address systemic issues that required sustained effort and institutional support. The friendship that developed between them was intensified by shared recognition that they could depend only on each other for emotional support and practical assistance that adults consistently failed to provide despite formal responsibilities and legal obligations that should have ensured adequate care regardless of family circumstances or economic situation. The bond that united them transcended normal sibling relationships to become survival partnership based on mutual protection and unwavering loyalty that made their individual identities inseparable from collective identity as sisters who faced world together. The games that they played during rare moments of peace were characterized by imagination that transformed harsh realities into manageable narratives where justice existed and good people were rewarded, while those who caused suffering faced appropriate consequences for their actions. The stories they created together revealed sophisticated understanding of moral principles combined with desperate hope that universe might ultimately operate according to ethical frameworks that their lived experience consistently contradicted through daily demonstrations of indifference to innocent suffering. But the most tragic aspect of their existence was not material deprivation or emotional neglect, but gradual realization that adult society was structured in ways that rendered their welfare irrelevant to decision-making processes that affected every aspect of their lives, while providing no mechanisms for them to advocate for themselves or seek help from institutions that theoretically existed to protect children from exactly the circumstances they endured without relief or hope for improvement through conventional channels. The exploitation that ultimately led to their deaths was orchestrated by adults who understood that society's failure to protect vulnerable children created opportunities for abuse that could be conducted without significant risk of intervention or punishment. Systematic predation that treated them as disposable resources rather than human beings whose lives possessed inherent value, regardless of their inability to defend themselves against overwhelming adult power and institutional indifference to their suffering. The basement where their final ordeal occurred had been prepared specifically for purposes that required isolation and soundproofing that would prevent their suffering from attracting attention that might have resulted in rescue or, at least, documentation of crimes being committed against children, whose disappearance would generate minimal investigation due to their marginal social status and lack of advocates who possessed resources necessary to demand accountability from authorities whose cooperation was essential for meaningful intervention. The death that they experienced together was prolonged beyond what physical trauma alone would have required. Psychological torture that seemed designed to maximize their terror and despair while extracting whatever satisfaction their tormentors derived from witnessing complete helplessness of victims who posed no threat and had committed no offense other than existing in circumstances that made them vulnerable to exploitation by individuals whose moral development had been corrupted by access to power over those who could not resist or escape. The cursed spirits that emerged from their collective suffering retained essential characteristics of their human personalities while being transformed by rage and grief that exceeded normal emotional categories to become supernatural, force dedicated to inflicting on others the kind of arbitrary cruelty that had defined their brief existence as living children. The consciousness that animated their cursed forms was simultaneously individual and collective, separate identities that functioned as components of shared purpose, that transcended personal considerations toward cosmic justice that human institutions had failed to provide. The haunting that followed their transformation was characterized by systematic targeting of adults whose behavior patterns suggested potential for similar crimes against vulnerable children, supernatural intervention that served protective function while providing retribution that conventional justice system had failed to deliver through legal procedures that prioritized due process over immediate elimination of threats to innocent people who could not wait for institutional mechanisms to function as theoretically intended. The manifestation of their cursed energy was unlike typical spirit behavior in its apparent ethical framework that distinguished between innocent people who deserved protection and guilty individuals whose actions warranted supernatural punishment, moral sophistication that suggested retention of human values despite transformation into entities whose existence was sustained by negative emotions that normally corrupted whatever wisdom or compassion might have survived death through cursed spirit formation. The investigation that brought them into contact with Jujutsu sorcerers revealed complexities that challenged standard approaches to cursed spirit elimination, circumstances where traditional exorcism techniques would have destroyed entities whose activities served legitimate protective functions while addressing problems that human society had failed to solve through conventional means. The moral questions raised by their case forced reconsideration of institutional policies that treated all cursed spirits as threats requiring immediate elimination, regardless of their motivations or effects. The communication that eventually developed between them and sorcerers who had been assigned to investigate their activities was conducted through methods that acknowledged their retained humanity while respecting their supernatural nature, diplomatic approach that sought understanding, rather than assuming that elimination was inevitable outcome of any encounter between human authorities and cursed entities whose existence challenged normal categories of friend and enemy. The stories that they shared about their human lives provided documentation of systemic failures that had enabled their abuse, while revealing individual personalities that had survived transformation to become driving forces behind their supernatural activities. The details they provided about their deaths served as evidence for investigations that might result in prosecution of surviving perpetrators, while highlighting institutional changes that could prevent similar tragedies from occurring in future through improved child protection services and community oversight. The philosophical discussions that emerged from these interactions revealed sophisticated understanding of justice and morality that exceeded what their chronological age should have enabled, while demonstrating how traumatic experiences could accelerate emotional and intellectual development in ways that preserved essential humanity, despite circumstances that might have been expected to produce only rage and desire for indiscriminate revenge against society that had failed to protect them from preventable harm. The decision that was ultimately made about their fate reflected institutional recognition that their case represented unique circumstances requiring innovative approaches that balanced respect for their retained humanity with acknowledgement that their supernatural nature created complications that standard procedures could not address through conventional applications of established policy regarding cursed spirit management and public safety considerations that extended beyond immediate tactical concerns. The sanctuary that was eventually established for them provided space where they could continue existing without posing threats to innocent people while maintaining their protective activities against individuals whose behavior patterns suggested potential for similar crimes against vulnerable children, compromised solution that honored their moral agency, while addressing institutional concerns about precedent that might complicate future decisions about cursed spirit management and elimination protocols. The years that followed their transformation into protected status were characterized by gradual integration into broader Jujutsu society as consultants whose unique perspective and supernatural capabilities contributed to child protection, efforts that conventional authorities had proven inadequate to provide through standard social services and law enforcement approaches that lacked understanding of predatory behavior patterns and institutional failures that enabled systematic abuse of vulnerable populations. The advocacy work that they eventually undertook was motivated by determination that their suffering should serve constructive purposes, rather than merely generating cycles of revenge that would perpetuate violence without addressing underlying social problems that created conditions where similar tragedies could occur despite theoretical existence of legal and institutional protections designed to prevent exactly the kind of abuse that had characterized their brief human existence. But the most significant aspect of their ongoing existence was demonstration that cursed spirits could retain essential humanity while serving beneficial functions that challenged institutional assumptions about supernatural entities and their relationship to human society. Proof that death through traumatic circumstances did not inevitably produce monsters whose existence served only destructive purposes without possibility of redemption or constructive contribution to collective welfare. The education programs that they helped develop were designed to train social workers, teachers, and law enforcement personnel to recognize signs of child abuse while providing them with resources necessary to intervene effectively before situations escalated to levels that resulted in permanent psychological damage or death of victims whose welfare should have been protected through competent application of existing legal frameworks and institutional procedures. The memorial services that were eventually held to honor their human lives provided opportunity for community healing while acknowledging societal failures that had enabled their abuse and death. Recognition that their transformation into cursed spirits represented not supernatural anomaly, but logical consequence of institutional indifference to vulnerable children, whose suffering generated compassion only after it was too late for such compassion to serve protective rather than merely commemorative purposes. The legacy that the Hasaba sisters created through their supernatural existence was embodied in improved child protection services and educational programs that reduced similar tragedies while demonstrating how traumatic experiences could be transformed into sources of strength and wisdom that served collective welfare rather than merely perpetuating cycles of violence and revenge that accomplished nothing beyond spreading suffering to additional innocent people who bore no responsibility for original crimes. Their story whispered through jujutsu facilities and social service agencies as a reminder that society's most vulnerable members deserve protection that extended beyond theoretical legal frameworks toward practical intervention and support that prevented abuse before it occurred, while holding accountable those whose failures enabled systematic exploitation of children, whose circumstances made them targets for predators, who understood that their crimes would generate minimal investigation or punishment through conventional justice systems. The forgotten sisters whose deaths had been transformed into supernatural protection became symbols of how tragedy could be transmuted into purpose through determination that suffering should serve meaning rather than merely generating additional pain, inspiration for others who faced similar choices between despair and dedication to ensuring that future generations would inherit a world where such preventable tragedies would become impossible through vigilant protection of those who could inherit, not protect themselves from forces that sought to exploit their vulnerability for purposes that served no constructive function in civilized society. And so we reach the gentle conclusion of our journey through the forgotten corners of Jujutsu society, where untold stories have whispered their truths into the compassionate darkness that embraces all who seek rest from the weight of remembering. These souls, the overlooked, the sacrificed, the quietly heroic, have shared their deepest sorrows and most profound wisdom with us tonight, reminding us that every life carries meaning beyond recognition or reward, that courage manifests in countless forms that history may never record but eternity will never forget. Let their stories settle into your dreams like autumn leaves, finding their final resting place each memory a testament to the beautiful complexity of human experience in all its triumph and tragedy. The boy who sought acceptance, the prisoner of flesh who yearned for touch, the creator who loved too deeply, the manager who served without glory. They all found peace not through fame but through the simple dignity of lives, lived with purpose and hearts that refused to surrender their capacity for hope. Close your eyes now, weary traveler, and let the infinite compassion of the forgotten welcome you into sleep's eternal embrace. Their vigil continues in realms beyond our understanding, watching over all who choose service over recognition, love over power, sacrifice over safety. Rest well, knowing that their stories live on in every act of quiet heroism, every moment of overlooked kindness, every soul who finds meaning through caring for others more than themselves. Sweet dreams, and may you wake tomorrow with their gentle strength flowing through your own noble heart.